Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to a new episode of GRAFF TV. Tonight, we're excited to have a Los Angeles icon in studio. Well known for covering the biggest news stories in Los Angeles history over his 30-year career, this investigative reporter made himself a household name for covering some of LA's biggest subcultures, such as graffiti, street gangs, tag banging, party crews, punks, and prison gangs. Ladies and gentlemen, help me in welcoming the 9-time Emmy Award winner and the only Los Angeles television reporter in history to win a Peabody Award for investigative journalism. Ladies and gentlemen, we have the one, the only Chris Blatchford, Fox 11 News. Yeah, man, awesome. It's amazing to have you in studio. I've been watching you on TV for years. We've all been watching you on TV for years. Welcome to the show, Mr. Blatchford.
Well,
how are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. Thank you for having me. It's always nice to hear those nice things about yourself.
Awesome, man. Thank you for accepting our invitation. Now, I'd love to get started with the interview as soon as possible, starting with, where are your parents from?
Well, my parents both grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, Illinois. And they met each other, though, back when they were like in their 20s. So.
Where were you born?
I was born in Highland Park, Illinois, which is the suburbs of Chicago.
Were you also raised there?
Yes, I grew up there, yeah.
What type of people were your parents growing up? Were they strict, religious, easygoing?
My mom was a very faith-based Irish Catholic, and my dad was a less interested religious person who grew up as a real WASP. I mean, you would have to describe his family as very waspish.
What does that mean? I'm sorry. Can you educate us on what that means?
Protestant, white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant family that he came from. Actually, his family went all the way back to the Mayflower. And his family was very rich in American history. And it's funny, as you talk about today, they were married in like 1942 or 3, and it was sort of scandalous because my dad, coming from a waspy, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant family, married this Irish Catholic. Although my mom was a beautiful woman and highly educated, it was still scandalous to marry an Irish Catholic back then.
Growing up, did you notice any of that tension from other people?
Where I grew up, it was in a fairly wealthy suburb of Chicago, but it had a pretty big mix of people from middle class all the way up to very wealthy people, and the school system was very good. What was your question again, though?
What type of people were your parents?
Both. My dad was highly educated, graduated from Dartmouth, an Ivy League college. My mom went to Northwestern University for 2 years, and then she went to Marymount College in New York and graduated from there. She was very artistic, my mother. She was a sculptor and a painter, but she was a housewife for 4 kids. And when she was 40, she went and got her teacher's certificate. And she taught 3rd grade for 10 years at a Catholic school. And then after that, she got a real estate license. And she did that for 10 years. And she was a smart woman who could tell a wonderful story. And I think, both sides of my family were kind of reaped in an appreciation of storytelling, and also pretty rich in people who made a living doing that. Yeah.
What was life like growing up for you?
The where I grew up was kind of a special place, really. It was right on the lake in the northern suburbs of Chicago. We had free reign in those days. You didn't worry anything about crime. We rode our bikes everywhere. We had a beach that we'd go to. We had parks. It was a great place to grow up. It really was. And the other thing is, like, the high school where I went was a public high school, but like 98% of the kids went on to college. So it was, and I was reading not far. The suburb that I grew up in was called Winnetka, Illinois. And interesting, I was just reading this about a year ago. 98% of the adults in that town graduated from college. So you were sort of really like a failure if you didn't do well, I think. Because
what was it about that place that made everyone achieve?
Well, part of it was most people had money, I think, and were able to send their kids to the better schools and live in the better suburbs. And it's funny because I spent most of my career in the news, in the inner city, in the ghetto, and I really grew up as a suburban kid,
Having such a high-achieving mother, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Well, that was interesting. My mother's had a sister whose husband had a cattle ranch in Montana, and I vacationed there in the summer. And actually, when I was 16, I worked as a cowhand for a summer. And if you'd asked me what I wanted to do when I was 16, I would have probably told you I wanted to be a rancher. I love the West. I loved wearing a cowboy hat and cowboy boots and riding a horse. And the West is beautiful country with a big sky, and I fell in love with it. And at 16, I probably would have told you that. But I'll tell you, I mentioned that my family was rich in literary skills, I think. And one of my dad's brothers was a newsman in Washington, a pretty legendary guy. And he wrote in his later years, he wrote a column in Washington for many years I think it was called In Town. And my grandparents, who didn't live far from us, used to read his columns to us. And sometimes they'd hang them on the bulletin board in their kitchen or whatever. And you guys are probably too young to remember, but when I was a boy, Davy Crockett was the biggest thing in the world. He was like Elvis or the Beatles or something, everything. He was one of the first guys. Fess Parker, who played Davy Crockett, was one of the first guys who did merchandising, and he had a piece of all that with Disney. And one day, at the height of Davy Crockett's popularity, he was in Washington for something, and my uncle did this column about him because every kid had a raccoon hat and fringe jacket and everything. We all wanted to look like Davy Crockett, And so next to his column, there was a picture of my uncle standing next to Davy Crockett, and I went, "Oh my God, he met Davy Crockett." I said, "That's a job for me, man. If you can spend time with Davy Crockett, that's a neat way to make a living." And I remember that was one of the first interests that I think I had in being a news reporter.
Did you make an effort to make that dream come true?
Well, I was very much into athletics as a kid. I mean, in elementary school, I played football, basketball, and baseball, and track. And in high school, I played football for a few years. And then my brother, who was a track star, I was like third in the league in the half mile. I ran like a 2:04 half mile when I was a sophomore in the Frost Soft division. And my brother told me, I was not a big guy, but I was fast. And he said, you should give up football. I rode the bench most of the time anyway. And he said, you should run cross country, and you might get a scholarship. So I switched to cross country. And he was right. I did. I got a partial scholarship to college, and I ran track and cross country at Miami University in Ohio. And my brother was right about that.
What did your parents say when you tell them you got a scholarship to the University of Miami, Ohio?
Not too much, really. We were all expected to go to college. It made it a little cheaper. But I basically, there were four of us, so we didn't come from a poor family. We're sort of upper middle class. But when you have, two kids in college for a period of about 10 years, we ended up mostly putting ourselves through college, with jobs and scholarships.
What kind of jobs would you have in college? Can you share that with us?
I've had so many. My wife and I were laughing about this the other night. I've had 20 different jobs in my life. I started when I was a kid. I would shovel snow in Chicago. I always had a lawn job in the summer, when I was like in 7th, 8th grade. And I caddied like when I was about 13 or 14 at a country club. I waited tables. I was a bus boy. I was a waiter. I was a ranch hand one summer. I shined shoes at a country club once. God, all kinds of, I was a lifeguard. I had an uncle who had a trucking company, and I spent 2 summers working on a beer truck in Chicago. Gosh, I can think that, what else?
How did you do athletically in college once there?
I did well, you know. I wasn't the biggest star in the world, but we were very good at cross country. It was the Mid-America Conference at that time. My junior year, we won the Mid-America Conference. We won like the Central States Championship. We won the All-Ohio Championship, and we were like 4th in the nation in the AAU. So we were really good. I was like in cross country, I was like the 3rd man usually. You know, you have 7-man teams in cross country, and you add up your scores, and the lowest scores win the meets. And I was good, but not great, you know.
What was your major in college? Were you pursuing reporting back then?
I was actually a speech major. I read once that that's what Edward R. Murrow was, a speech major. And I was pretty good always at talking. And I could create a good image always in a speech, I think. And so I was in what they call radio TV with a major in speech. Yeah.
We usually hear colleges where young kids protest or they go wild. What were some of the biggest stories going on while you were in college? Do you remember that time?
You know, I was a jock really in college, you know. I never got into the protest movement or anything, although I had friends that went to different, you know, the whole protesting in the 60s, the anti-war movement, I mean, it was very heavy on the East Coast and the West Coast. And then, you know, by the time just about the time I graduated from college, it hit the Midwest, you know. And my wife was a year younger than I was. Her senior year, you know, there were the killings in Kent State in Ohio. And everybody at Miami University in Ohio, where we went, knew somebody who went to Kent State. So overnight, I went back to visit my wife, I remember, like a year later. And the whole campus changed. You know, like when I left and graduated in '69, you know, guys wore like, you know, slacks and kind of nice Gant shirts and things like that. And I went back, everybody had hair down to here and bell-bottom jeans and tie-dye t-shirts, you know, everything changed like overnight, and everybody was really radicalized. And that year, like in 1970, you know, they burned down the ROTC Hall, and there were all kinds of protests on campus, and cops were on the campus, but I was gone by then, you know. So I wasn't real political in college. I was more of a jock, really. But I always really wanted to, at that point, really wanted to be a TV journalist. There were a lot of people in my family that were journalists, going way back. I mean, my great uncle was Charles Kickham, was part of the Fenian movement in Ireland, and he was a newspaper man, and he wrote a book called Knocknagour, which was all about Irish folklore and how the people were mistreated by the English. And he actually served a couple of years in an English prison for his writings, you know. I had another cousin who worked for the New York World, which was the original Pulitzer paper in New York City, and he was full of stories all the time. And I had another cousin who worked at the Chicago Tribune, who was about 6 or 7 years older than I was, and I used to see his byline. It seemed like a great thing to be a part of what was happening in the world. You know, I can't imagine, and with no disrespect to an accountant or a lawyer or anything, but I can't imagine sitting in an office all day, like crunching numbers. Or I was never that good at math anyway, but it really appealed to me to get out in the world, you know, and talk to people. I've always been interested in people. Like my wife always teases me. We'll be like in a line at the airport or something, waiting for a ticket, and she'll turn around and say, like, by the time we get to the front of that line, you're going to know everything about that guy in front of us in line, more than his wife knows, you know. I'm just very, very curious about people. I have a genuine interest, and when we came here, I started asking you guys things. I like to know where people come from, what they think, what they believe in. You know, it's something that makes the world go round. And everybody does have a story, you know. And the more I think that you were asking me about interviews, you know, like when you share a little bit of your life, you get back from people about their life, I think, you know. And that's one of the most valuable things you can do in an interview, is open yourself up a little bit in a pre-interview so people sort of get to know you, and then you get a lot more back, you know.
Definitely. Thank you for those wise words, Mr. Blatchford. Now, I want to go back to college, actually. What kind of a person were you in college? I know you were an athlete, and athletes usually have the run of the school. Were you popular in college? Were you a ladies' man? And did you dabble in any drugs?
No, I never did drugs. No, I did a little marijuana after I graduated, because when I was like 22, 23, you'd go to a party and somebody'd hand you a joint, But I was never into it. My father was an alcoholic, and so I never really wanted to drink much. I mean, I got drunk a little bit in college, at like fraternity parties a couple of times, but I was always very leery, and I always warned people off drinking and drugs. My father was a wonderful guy. But he was a World War II vet. And this always cracks me up. He was a dive bomber pilot in the Pacific. And he didn't even know my brother till he was a year and a half. And he was in a squadron of dive bomber pilots. These are guys who came into targets and dropped bombs and then took off, and there's flak going on all around you. Out of the 200 guys that were in his squadron, 2/3 of them were killed. And I think my dad, his whole life, had PTSD. And when those guys came home from World War II, they didn't send them to psychologists or anything. They just, go get a job, Their dad bought them a suit and sent them out, to work. But they suffered a great deal. And I think my dad suffered from PTSD his whole life. And I think that was the cause of his drinking, And I think that, a few years ago, a friend of our family's, a guy about a little younger than I am, he said, you should ask my mother about your father. She said, because when he came back after the war, he was really never the same, And we never understand, I don't think, people who go to war and come back. You're never the same, I don't think.
Did your father ever share with you any stories of the war?
He never talked about the war. Once when I was a kid and we took a long driving trip somewhere, I stayed up with him all night and he talked a little bit about it. And then back in his late 70s, he a couple times talked to me about some war things, but mostly it was the good memories, not the bad ones, He had some funny stories about things that happened, and that's what he chose to remember, I think.
What do you think about how veterans are being treated these days?
Oh, I think John Kerry, when he ran for president, said something that really resonated with me then and still does now, and I've repeated this often to people. It's like, whether you believe in a war or not, he said, don't confuse the war with the warrior. Don't blame the guy who goes to war or had to go to war or volunteered to go to war for the right reasons. Don't blame him for the war if it's a bad war. And I think that's an important thing to remember. And I think a lot of people that are anti-war, which we all are really, I don't think anyone really loves war, but when people come back who actually fought the wars, I think you have to show them some respect. I mean, whether you agree with the war or not, they made a sacrifice that you certainly didn't make, And in so many cases, I mean, World War II in particular, people made the ultimate sacrifice. I mean, every family was touched by somebody who was killed or severely injured or a prisoner of war or something, It's nothing. I think anybody who was in a protest should go in with clear eyes, trying to understand the other side of that issue,
Definitely. Thank you for sharing that piece of history about your father.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now, I want to go back to college. When do you graduate college? Go ahead.
I graduated in 1969.
And what are your plans after college? Do you have any plans?
Well, yeah, I wanted to go into the radio TV business. And, when I graduated from college, they had the draft. And my draft number was number 4, so no one would hire me. When I went to a job, they'd ask you your draft job. So I mean, I worked in a factory, in a chemical factory, making chairs out of chemicals, for about a year, and because that's the only job I could get for about a year. And then finally, I got a 1Y deferment because I grew up with asthma, and sinusitis. And then I got a job at this little 250-watt radio station in Frankfort, Indiana. It was like a farm town. It was called the home of the Frankfurt hot dogs. That was their name. And it was a town of 10,000 people and a county of 30,000, rural, about 30 miles north of Indianapolis. And they had a basketball stadium that sat 5,000 people. And when they had a good team, that thing was filled every week. Indiana basketball is amazing, yeah.
I want to back up a little bit how you mentioned about the draft. Knowing that you had such a close number, what were your feelings about the Vietnam War back then?
Well, you know, when I was a freshman in college, I wanted to be a Green Beret because we didn't know about the bad side of the war yet. You know, you had John Wayne in a movie being a Green Beret and everything. And I was always sort of a jock, and I was always in great shape. You know, I'm in high school. I set a high school record for the obstacle course they had there, you know. And so I was always in good shape. So I was ready to go in the service, and my dad had been in the service, you know. And but then, you know, as college came on, and friends did flunked out of college or something. One friend I went to high school with, who I played football with, was killed. He was in a helicopter crash over there. One of my fraternity brothers, who was 2 years older than me, was killed in a firefight in Vietnam, and he got posthumously the Congressional Medal of Honor. I mean, he was a lieutenant in the Marines, and he'd been a Navy ROTC guy, but went into the Marines, and he was a great guy. He was a big high school football player. He was married to a beautiful girl who was heir to the Jim Beam liquor fortune, you know, and 6 months after he graduated, he was killed. And I remember I was lifting weights in the basement of the fraternity house, you know, and I heard that he was killed. Somebody told me, you know, and I remember I just started to cry. All that stuff's painful. You see the waste of war. To get my composure here. I know I had another friend who grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and he played football. This was another fraternity brother, and he had a guy who went to Vietnam and had just come back. And he told us a story that he was a helicopter gunner. And he said it dehumanized him. And he told a story that they were flying along in their helicopter, and the pilot looked down and there was an old woman riding a bike. And he said, "I'll bet you can't hit that lady, you know." And he shot and killed her. And he's telling us this story, you know, and he was on the edge of tears. And he said it just made a different person out of him. And that's not the guy he was, you know. And I had another friend, little Italian guy I grew up with at Catholic elementary school. He went over there and came back, and I just graduated from college at that time, and he was working for his uncle who had like a refrigerator and dryer and washer repair company, and he was like doing like a internship there or something, you know. And I hadn't seen him since like grade school, I think, and he'd come back. And he just said, "Go to Canada, you know, don't go there, you know." And in the meantime, I was waiting to get drafted. And then I was in a bar one night after work, and the guy I went to high school with was there, and he'd had his arm blown off from here down, you know, and he was in a troop transport truck that blew out, hit a landmine, and everyone was killed in it except him, and he was sitting in the back, and it just blew off his arm. And there was another friend of mine from elementary school who I ran into, and he couldn't even keep a job as a bartender because his hands shook so much from his experience in Vietnam. So by the time, you know, like I was waiting to get drafted, I was hearing a lot of really negative things about the war. And I had a couple friends who called me in the 1968 when the Chicago, the Democratic Convention was in Chicago, and they were going to go down there and protest, you know. And at that point, I just graduated from college. I had mixed feelings about the war, you know. I was hearing all these stories from people coming back, and the news was starting to turn against the war. And I didn't go with them, you know, at that night. But one of my friends who did go there, who was a high school football star and track star, a handsome guy, had gone to Harvard. And he was studying, he was in the divinity school there. And he got all messed up in drugs, you know. And it really screwed up his life for a while. In the end, he became a minister, but it took him a long time. And it was bad times, you know. The older generation was split. I mean, we talk about bad times today, but people are bad students of history, you know. The 60s and 70s were a horrible time. I mean, our parents, you know, came from the World War II generation. They didn't understand that there'd be a war, that maybe America was at fault being there, you know. So as you learn more about the war, there was tremendous friction between the older generation and the younger generation, you know. And it was a very tense time, you know. And then you had the shootings at like Jackson State and Kent State, and like, you know, all this is going through your mind, and you're just like, hey, my God, is this something I want to be a part of or not, you know? And I was lucky in the end. I mean, I wasn't ready to go to Canada. I mean, I'm an American, and I'm proud to be an American. And I would fight for my country. I mean, if they were on the shores of California or whatever. But I look back at the two friends I had that were killed there and everything. I was just like, you know, McNamara years later talked about how it was a mistake going to that war and everything. I don't feel badly about not going there, but I have another friend who was a fraternity brother of mine, who was also on the track team with me. He was a shot putter and a discus thrower, a very good one. And a few summers ago, he told me he's guilty that he didn't go to Vietnam. And I said, especially because this friend of ours in the fraternity was killed there, you know. And I said, no, I don't feel that way, you know. I feel lucky that I didn't have to go, you know, because it really wasn't a righteous cause.
Thank you for sharing that incredible history, Mr. Blatchford.
You know, whatever you do in life, though, as you go on, you know, you've got your 15-year-old daughter here. You know, everything that happens to you shaped your life. And I think, and one thing, you know, when you talk about the stories I did in LA, and a lot of it had to do with young people, you know. And I think it's really important to talk to young people about choices in life. And I think that's one of the real tragedies with, you know, the gangsters we see all over. You know, it's just like, you can be better than that. And I remember when I wrote this book, The Black Hand, about the Mafia, I was interviewed by this guy who has his own website, and he's studied gangs a lot. And I think he has his PhD from USC. But it's just, as an older person, you really do have a responsibility to try to reach younger people and push them in the right direction, you know. And when you're 15 or 16, and maybe you're not a good student, or maybe you're not a football player, and maybe you don't have much going, you know, all of a sudden, you know, you join a gang, and you think it gives you status. But, you know, if you go to Pelican Bay, where I've been like 3 or 4 times, and you talk to some honest guys there, you know, like, none of them are happy. Which they made in life, you know. And so many of the choices you can make, and that really was the purpose of all the stories we did, you know. But you mentioned what, taggers, party crews, tag bangers, all that stuff. I mean, it's like, I always tried to put in those stories. Sometimes some people criticize us for like glorifying that stuff, but in my mind, it was never glorifying that, you know. It was all to get the message that this is a stupid thing to do, you know. And it is a stupid choice to go in that direction. And I would say to any young person, you know, it's stupid to drink. It's stupid to do drugs. You know, we can go walk out here a few blocks from here and find guys out in the street who are, you know, are drunks or drug addicts. And I mean, their lives are done. They're done. And a lot of them had started when they were 14 or 15 years old, you know. And you can prevent that. I mean, I don't care if you're from a poor family. I mean, funny, I used to speak a couple times a year. There was Nellis Boys Home, which was in Whittier. It's been closed down now, but it was a prison for kids under 25. And everybody in there at that time, and like in the 90s, were either there for murder or attempted murder, you know. And I spoke there like twice, I think, or maybe 3 times. And I got to know there was a guy who ran a no gang program there, and he'd asked me to come speak. And I remember talking to those kids, and like, you know, one-on-one, I mean, they were all pretty nice kids, and they got wrapped up in this thing, you know. They thought it was glamorous because, you know, maybe they made some money selling drugs, or, you know, you see some Mexican mafia guy in the neighborhood and people are deferring to him, you know. And it's, but you know, really, they don't respect those people. They fear them, you know, and they confuse fear with respect, you know. And I mean no disrespect to the Mexican mafia, but, you know, those guys are ruining kids' lives by giving them an image that this is something good. Because I'll tell you, I've known dozens of those guys, and none of them are happy. None of them are happy. And, you know, say you're not college bound or anything, that's okay. I mean, you can make good money today being a plumber or a bus driver or any number of things, you know. And that's a better choice in the long run. Maybe you won't live in the big house on the hill or be driving the Cadillac Excalibur or anything, but you're going to have a better life than that guy that's going to either end up dead or in Pelican Bay for the rest of his life. And unless those people are absolutely crazy, I mean, they'll tell you they wasted their lives, you know.
Thank you for those wise words,
Yeah.
Mr. Blatchford. Now, I want to back up. After college, you're working odd jobs here and there. You avoid the draft. Mm-hmm. How do you first get a job as a reporter in your local town?
Well, I just, after I graduated from college, you know, I was waiting to get drafted. And I went to this, in Chicago, they had like this broadcast school that I went to for like 6 months, beyond my college years. And the guy there helped me get this job in this little town in Indiana. The guy who ran the station there called up the school and said, you know, you have somebody who could really come and do this job for us. We're looking for like a guy who would be the news reporter, you know, and on the radio. And this guy recommended me. I went down there, and I was tending bar at the time, and at an Elks Club in Evanston, Illinois. And I went down and interviewed, and the guy gave me the job. And you know, 4 days later, I headed down there. It was my first job as a news guy.
What were your duties? Were you nervous? Was it an overwhelming experience?
No, no, I was pretty much ready for it, you know. I'll tell you, I did get nervous a few times, though. It's a funny story. I was sleeping late one day, and I had applied for a job through Broadcasting Magazine in a little station in South Dakota. And this guy called, and he was looking for some young guy to help him do the news at this little radio station he had. And my brother wakes me up, and you know, I'd been working late the night before, and he said, there's a guy on the phone from South Dakota, you know, he wants to talk to you about a job. So my brother hands me the phone, and he's laughing, and like the guy says, could you read something for me, you know? And I'm going like, okay, and I grab something and I start reading, and my voice starts going like this, and I didn't get the job, you know. But you know, you get that sometimes that anxious thing, you know, and it sort of steals your voice, you know. That's happened to me a few times, you know.
In the beginning, were you only focused on radio jobs, or was television not in your?
No, I always wanted to do television, but radio was the quickest way in at that time.
How long do you last at that radio station?
I worked there about 9 months, and then I answered another ad in Broadcasting Magazine for a TV radio job in Ottumwa, Iowa, which was another farm town of about 30,000 people. And it had a meat packing plant there and a John Deere plant, and most everybody in the town worked there, you know. And I worked the radio side in the morning and TV in the afternoon. And I learned a lot there, though. You know, I always recommend somebody wants to get in the radio, TV business to work at a small station, because you end up doing everything. You know, you shoot your film. In those days it was film. You know, you produce shows. You're on the air. And you find out what you're good at, or you find out you're good at everything, and it makes you a much better I mean, I can tell the difference between somebody like me who started at like a little radio station and worked their way up. I was 38 when I came to Los Angeles. Now there's, you know, with these internship programs and everything, some of these kids come in today and like they go work a year in Bakersfield and then in LA, you know, and I can tell the difference. You know, they didn't have the background that I think I had in the television. I could do everything. I've done all the jobs, you know.
As you're getting these jobs at radio stations and small TV stations, are you only focused on reporting? Are you trying to get an anchor job?
I've had both, you know. I mean, I started in Indiana, in a small town. Then I went to Ottumwa, Iowa, which is a small town. Then I spent 2.5 years in Peoria, Illinois. And there well, in Ottumwa, I anchored the noon news and I did the morning radio. In Peoria, I started as the weekend anchor, and I was there about a year, and then they made me the anchor on the two shows, 5 and 11. And then I produced those shows too. And at the same time, you do reporting, you know, you do a lot in the smaller markets. And then I went to Kansas City for 5 years, and I anchored the weekends there. And I went to Miami, and I did reported there at first, and then I anchored the weekends, and I did a lot of substitute anchor work there in the main shows. And then I came to LA as a weekend anchor at the CBS station here.
Before coming to LA, I want to talk about getting the job as an anchor. Was that a big deal to you when they finally let you know that?
No, I mean, I anchored a little bit at all the TV stations that I went, and I was never enamored with the anchoring, really, you know. I mean, you get over I really loved being out and doing stories much more than anchoring. I mean, anchoring, some of these anchor guys are kind of stupid, and I think one reason is, you know, who wants to just sit there and read copy all afternoon? I mean, I'd rather be out there really covering the news, you know. And there are anchor guys that are really good news guys, but there are other anchor guys who've just been reading in the studio their whole life, you know.
As you're making your way up the ladder, paying your dues, what was the toughest part about those early jobs?
The long hours and not much money, you know. I think we lived near the poverty line in some of those early jobs, you know. It's funny, like the engineers at those stations, you know, the guys who work behind the cameras and all the technical areas, they all made in those small markets more money than the news people did, because most of the news people were going to work there a year or two and then move to a larger market. And a lot of those guys that had the engineering jobs, you know, they were staying there for a whole career. They lived in that town, you know. So really the news guys were always the lowest paid.
Now that you're on the news often, you're anchoring the news station, what does your family say on your success?
Not too impressed with it, I don't think, really. I think my parents would be kind of proud of me, but my wife has always kept me humble. You know, she's never been too impressed with it.
At this time, though, how are you feeling about your success, climbing up, making a name for yourself?
Well, you know, my climb was a slow climb. You know, like I said, I was 38 when I came to LA, and then I worked there as a news guy for 30 years. You know, it happened. You know, it happens so fast. You know, you're not contemplating it along the way, really. I look back on my career now. I met a lot of interesting people. I got to do a lot of interesting things. I mean, you know, when I go to a party somewhere, I mean, people will ask me what I do for a living. You know, they're not really asking the accountant, you know, what he does. But I have a treasure chest full of experiences that I wouldn't trade for any other profession or any other job. You know, it was great, really, you know. The politics of it can be really bad, especially when you get into larger markets, because people are all, you know, vying for the anchor position or better reporting. You know, that part is really, like you see that in the movies, it's really like that. It's really competitive, you know. And there are people stabbing you in the back, and, you know, people who are maybe envious of what you're doing. And but, you know, pretty much what I did, I carved out by myself, you know. Nobody handed me anything, you know. I've worked really hard, long hours. I mean, even in Los Angeles, I mean, you know, during sweeps periods, I'd work 8 weeks straight without a day off, 12 hours a day,
As you mentioned, you were an anchor in Kansas, then you also moved to Miami.
Yes.
Can you tell us what kind of stories were you covering in Miami? What was
Miami was when I was in Miami from 1980 to 85. It was the murder capital of the United States at that time. It was the main center for drug trafficking at the time. You had Haitians washing up on the beach that were coming in, and Cubans. The Mariel boat lift from Cuba at that time. Castro had emptied his prisons of like 10,000 people and unleashed them on Miami. There was a murder there, I remember, of an old woman for a guy. He murdered her for $1.50. There was another guy who just shot a kid for fun, I remember, who was fishing on a bridge. I mean, Castro dumped his worst criminals on Miami. And so that city, even the police at that time said if you were in Miami at night, if you have a stoplight, stop at the light and just go, because people were on the street corners grabbing gold chains off people's necks, grabbing purses, putting guns in your face and asking for your wallet. I remember one night I worked really late. There was a place in Miami Beach that was like a 24/7 restaurant. And as a result of that, cops ate for free there, And I worked really late one night, and it was like 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'd gone in to get something to eat before I went home. And I walk outside in the parking lot, and I see two guys standing by my car, young guys. And they're looking at me, and I went, oh my God, I'm going to get rolled here, So I had a trench coat on because it was kind of a cold night. And I stuck my hand in my, like this, like I had a shoulder holster. And I walked right up these guys, and said, good evening, gentlemen, how are you? And they looked at each other like they thought I was a cop, I think, and they just left me alone. But yeah, Miami was a wild place at that time. It really was. I mean, it was, but for a news guy, it was a really fun place to work,
In Miami, you're anchoring the news. Is that where you begin your investigative journalism? Are you covering?
I always did a little investigative stuff wherever I worked. And even when I came here and at Channel 2, I remember, I started doing investigative things, but I was doing general assignment things too. And I remember one of the bosses said, well, you want to be a full-time investigative reporter? And I went, well, no, I don't. Because in TV, they want you on the air every day almost, And if you say you're the investigative reporter, you can't do an investigative report every day. Like you see some of these stations, they advertise, we're investigating this. And, a lot of times it's some guy who bought a refrigerator and it didn't work. And to me, that's not the kind of stuff that I did. And so I didn't want to be named the investigative reporter all the time because I was always working on things. Even if I was working general assignment, I was always on the phone or working long-term, And then when I worked at the Fox station here, 11, I had a lot of opportunity where they'd leave me off for a couple of months, and before sweeps and everything. I'd say I spent like probably, half to three-quarters of my time, my first 5 or 6 years there, doing nothing but, working on long-term stories. And that was a great job. I mean, Fox turned into sort of a right-wing propaganda thing now, but we didn't see any of that in the beginning. There were a handful of us that left CBS and went to Fox, which was just a startup at the time. Murdoch had bought Metro Media's 5 stations, and my boss at the time had come from CBS, and they pretty much just let us do whatever we wanted. I mean, we were doing pieces that were 5-10 minutes long, and if other jobs you have, people are doing pieces. The standard piece on the air is like a minute and a half, And then you'd always have these producers. Even when I was at Channel 2 once, I did a series of stories called Gang Godfathers. It was like the first generation of crack millionaires in South Central and Compton. And I remember, I lost my train of thought here. Oh, yeah. I did a piece about a guy named Michael Harrio Harris, who was a bounty hunter blood. And he made millions, and
Famously known as Harry O.
Famously known as Harry O. And that piece ran 10 and a half minutes. And the producer of the 6 o'clock news went to the news director and said, you know, Chris Blatchford's going to ruin my show and everything. You know, he's got this piece of 10.5 minutes, you know. And he said, I can't work with him. You know, he's working on all these long pieces are ruining my show. And that piece jumped 4.5 points in the show, you know. It had the highest ratings that show ever had, you know. And so when I went to Channel 11, the same boss that had left Channel 2 had gone to Channel 11. And he really gave us carte blanche to work on stuff for about 5 or 6 years, you know. And then things changed a little bit after that. But that was the best job I ever had for about 5 or 6 years, you know.
Thank you. I actually want to back up. After your experience in Miami, you then moved to CBS News. What brings up that change from Miami to Los Angeles?
Well, I just had enough. There was a headhunter who got me that job. She's out of New York. Her name was Shirley Barish, and she sent my tapes around, and you know, they offered me that job. They flew me out here, and I interviewed. And you know, coming to LA and working for CBS, that's a CBS-owned station, and you know, CBS was like, when I grew up, that was the place. Walter Cronkite, and you know, had all the great TV shows, and that was the network, you know. So when I first walked through that TV City and they take your picture, and I saw that CBS up there, I thought, man, now you've arrived, you know. I was really proud to work for CBS, but it changed.
Does your wife or your family try to talk you out of moving halfway across the country?
No, my wife is just a great person, you know. I could have never done the things that I did. You know, the divorce rate in TV, like policemen, you know, is very high because the hours are long and there's danger involved and there's volatility involved and there's not a lot of security in the jobs in TV. You can get fired you know, there's new management, boom, you can lose your job like that. My wife just was always great, you know. I couldn't have done what I did without my wife. She's just a wonderful woman, you know. Smarter than I am too, you know. But she was always supportive, you know, and just, you know, whatever I wanted to do, she was there for me, you know. I'll tell you, one of the greatest things you can have in life, and this gets off the subject of news or something, is unconditional love. And I've been a lucky man to have that, a wife who gave me that we've been married for 53 years. And unconditional love is a gift.
Congratulations on that.
Yeah.
Now, I want to ask you, when you do eventually come to CBS, do you get a huge paycheck?
No, not what people think. You know, I think when I went there, the huge money, I think, was starting to go away even then, and that would have been 1985. I wasn't one of the highest paid people. You know, there were guys, you know, a little older than me that made probably 3 times what I made. You know.
Do you experience a new level of fame now that you're on CBS, and how does that affect your everyday life?
You know, it just. The fame question, I don't know. You guys say that I am an iconic figure. You know, I never really felt that. You know, I just doing my job every day. I mean, I'll tell you, it's wonderful walking down the street and having people come up and say, "Hey, you know, I love that story you did about this or that." You know, that's great gratification. You know, living in LA for 40 years. You know. You guys do, you go places, you run into real stars, like movie stars. And it's always funny, like if I see one somewhere, I'll always go up and say, thank you for those great films you've done and everything, you know. And they like that, I think. And I always enjoyed that too, you know, because people aren't bothering you. They're taking the time out to you know, what other job? I mean, if you're an accountant, somebody's not coming up in the street and go, hey, those taxes you did for me last year, that was killer, you know. So that's one of the gratifying things, I think. You know, you get feedback for the work you do, and that's one of the high points, I think, of being on television. And really, you know, I'll speak to a lot of gang investigators groups over the years, and I always tell them that, you know, I always felt that my job was a privilege, and that theirs is too. Because you have a chance to change people's lives and be a part of their lives. And that is a privilege. And I think cops have that, firemen have that, and I think newsmen have that.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now that you're in Los Angeles, you're working at CBS, You're in Los Angeles, you're on top of the world. What's the wildest thing you did back then?
Oh God.
Is there anything that outrageous that you bought? Any incredible trip you took? Do you celebrate all the success that's...
No, not really. Your life remains pretty much the same. It's easier to pay your bills because you're now in a union shop where the minimum even is a good living. And you're able to live in an upper middle class living, and that's the first place we were really able to do that in our journeys.
Is there a tough part about having all this new fame?
No, not really. No, I think No, I mean, you talk about fame. I mean, I never really thought of myself of being that famous. I mean, I think like, if I saw Al Pacino on the street, I think he's famous, or if I saw Tom Hanks, he's famous. I never really thought of myself that way. I'll tell you a funny story. One day I was doing a live shot outside of City Hall in Santa Monica. And, the Rand Corporation has a building there right across the street. And I was right on the edge of the parking lot there, ready to do a live shot about something, And I look up and like 20 feet away, I hear this bum, 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 bum. And there's two motorcycles there, And it's Sly Stallone is one of them, And he starts going up and he starts coming for me. And I go, "Hey, Sly." And he goes, "Hey." I just laughed, But that's what happens in LA. Like if those guys are the stars, I never really thought of myself of having that kind of stature at all. You're nice to say so, but I never saw myself that way,
Thank you. Now, I want to go back to CBS. Once you arrive at CBS, who are some of the anchors there? Who are some of the personalities there when you arrive?
When I arrived, it was John Schubeck and Jess Marlowe. And Sandy Hill was the woman anchor there at the time. Colleen Williams was there. Actually, I was hired to do the weekends with Colleen Williams. But Sandy Hill, who was the main anchor woman, had a baby, and she left, and Colleen almost immediately started anchoring the main shows, and I was left on the weekend. It's funny, though, I did the weekends for about a year there, and I started out with Colleen, who became famous in L.A., much more so than me. And then I did Ann Curry, who became very, very famous. And I did it with, and then Paula Zahn, who became very, very famous, and Pam Hill, who became a big anchor woman in San Francisco. So all the women I worked with then had careers that made mine look like lunch meat.
Once you arrive in LA and are at CBS, are you surprised how news in Los Angeles is covered compared to Miami and Kansas?
I'd say the major difference was LA has such a wide area. Like, I worked in New York just as a freelance writer for just a few weeks, and looking at that newsroom, all those guys and their news was sort of confined to Manhattan. But in LA, it was a great news market because you could be in the mountains one day, and you can be at the beach the next, or you can be in the inner city the next. And we have all kinds of different organized crime here. We have all kinds of politics here. I really think LA is the spot to be in the United States. It used to be New York, and everything moved west. I think now, everything starts in LA and moves east. I love Los Angeles. I grew up in Chicago, and I think that's a great city. My son, actually, when we go visit his grandparents in the Chicago area, he used to say, like, if Chicago were located in LA, it'd be the greatest city in the world. But all these people who hate LA, I don't feel that way at all. I think, for a news guy, it's an interesting place. There's all kinds of things going on here. How could you not like it?
When you arrive at CBS, what was Los Angeles like in that era? Do you remember?
Well, I tell you, I got pretty quickly, funny, when I was in Miami, I did a lot of stories about drugs and immigration and murders, and then when I came here, actually, I did a 10-part series in Miami about the cocaine cowboys and the cocaine cowboy wars, and I did another 5-part series about all the drugs coming through the Bahamas. And at that time, there was a congressman in Fort Lauderdale named Clay Shaw, who took all those pieces and played them in Congress. And as a result of that, George H.W. Bush was vice president at the time. They formed a what they call the Vice Presidential Task Force, which they put all this manpower in Florida to stop the drug trade. And they have those AWACS planes, you know, flying with a radar and everything. And because there's 3,000 miles of coastline around Florida, and the smugglers just loved it, you know. So then when we moved, that kind of shut down some of the drug trade, a lot of it, in Miami. So when I moved to LA right a year or so after that, and my God, here we go. All the drugs were coming through Mexico here, you know, and all the immigration was coming through here. So it was like deja vu all over again, you know. So all those stories that I did in Miami kind of showed up here, you know.
Were you happy with the way things turned out at CBS? Your stories, your time there?
You know, I had a lot of different, the news director is the boss, you know, of a newsroom. And I had about, in the 7 years I was there, I think I had like 4 different bosses or something. So every time it starts over again, you know, and you do, like I mentioned, the Gang Godfather series, we did some really good stuff. And then a new boss would come in, and then you'd be back on general assignment for a year or something, you know. So it's just, you got to take the good with the bad, you know.
Is there anything you would have done differently at CBS?
Well, I think I ultimately got fired there because a new boss came in, and he thought we all made too much money, and I was the first guy at contract up, and he fired me to make an example. And I remember the guy who was a head of CBS owned stations in New York that time, a guy named Eric Ober. I called him up and I said, "What the hell's going on? You know, like I just won the Peabody Award, which is like the ultimate award you can win in TV, like a few months earlier, you know." And they hired this guy who was just a maniac from Seattle, you know, and he was going to fire everybody. I had a photographer friend of mine who had a friend in Seattle where this guy came from. And he said he was running around the station up there with our contracts going like, you know, I'm going to fire all these people, you know, they make too much money or anything, you know. And yeah, but relatively speaking, you know, we weren't making much more money than most people, you know.
Did you have a hint that this...
No, nothing. It came right out of left field. I was totally shocked.
How do you break the news to your wife?
Difficult. It's difficult, you know. Yeah, I don't know if you've ever been fired before, but they say it's like a death in the family, you know, especially when you have 2 little kids, you know.
What goes through your head when they tell you you're fired? You have 2 kids and a family.
Well, I was lucky because my boss, who was one of the best bosses I ever had the last year or 2 at CBS, he had gone to Channel 11, the Fox station. And so I was out of work for like a week. And I just went right over there, and it was a much better job over there. You know.
How does he offer you the job? Do you remember? Do you get a phone call?
Yeah, I think I just got a phone call, you know, and you know, the word spread. There was a big newspaper article in the Times when I got fired, you know. I think yeah.
Not just Fox 11, but was KCAL calling?
No, really, no. It was just Fox was, you know, just Fox was interested because I had my old boss was there and he knew what I could do.
Did Fox make any promises to you, like you're going to have your own investigative journalist segment, or what was the deal?
It was pretty much I was just, you know, I was just going to be a reporter there, you know.
Do you get a bump in pay, more control while at Fox?
I did get a bump in pay, basically though because of overtime. Like at Channel 2, they never paid overtime, and I often worked 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, and they gave you a straight salary. But at Channel 11 Fox, you got overtime, and I worked all kinds of overtime, so I made more money there than I'd ever made before, you know.
What was that like once you get paid?
It's nice to get paid.
Do you buy anything outrageous then?
No, I'm just, you know, I'm not a materialistic guy. You know, my wife and I pretty much live the life that we've always lived, you know. We're really not into, we're not into things.
Can you tell us about your first day at Fox? What was that like?
Oh, you know, it was the week of the riots. And my first night there was the first night of the riots. And so that first week was bizarre. And I think it was the second day of the riots. I was out with 2 photographers. And we were down in South LA, and we followed some smoke. And we got right, this won't mean anything to people who don't live here, but down around Rodeo Drive there was this big Sears Roebuck store down there, and it was burning, and we showed up there, and there were hundreds of people looting. And then remember, there was a policeman holding a gun on a woman who had a TV set, you know, but there's hundreds of people coming out of this Sears with stuff. And there was a guy pulled up, and he just had his face was bloody. You know, they broke his window, and he was just driving home from the airport, and they nearly killed him. And he was like slumped over in his car, and then there's a mob there, and I mean, just everything that was happening in the riots was happening at that moment in that spot, and we just happened to follow the smoke and arrive there. And it was really scary. And I remember there was a crowd that about 200 people that just was going, leaving the Sears store and then another shops across, just going to store, breaking the windows and stealing everything. And then we went back to our van. We had a live van there. We came in a station wagon, me and the two photographers, and they sent a live van down there, and it stalled, you know. So we're sitting in that, and all of a sudden, we're surrounded by like 200 people, and things are hitting the van like bam, bam, like bottles and rocks and everything, you know. And the van was shaking like they were trying to, you know, turn it over. And the two photographers I was with and the guy who was in the van, they're all black. And I'm the only white guy. And they go, Blatchford, get the fuck down. He's sitting down. And I'm down like this. And they say, stay down, stay down. And but finally, I pop my head up. And there's a guy like this, and you know, like the iron part of the tire, you know, not with a wheel, but he had that, and he slammed it into the window and smashed the window shield. And these guys say, "Get down," you know. And we just thought, oh man, this could be the end, you know. And these people are all yelling at us, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this cop on a motorcycle pulls right up in front of the van. And he had a shotgun slung on his head, and he pulls that shotgun down, and he yells at these people, you know, and he pulled them off. And I thought, oh my God, you know, I mean that's where that's a hero cop, you know. And so then we ran back to the station wagon, which was across the street where we left, and we were taking our equipment with us from this van, and we looked around, and everyone was gone. And all of a sudden, about 200 yards away, the crowd had moved away, and the parking lot and the Sears and everything. And all these guys look at me and they go, "What do we do?" And I saw a cop car all of a sudden. I said, "Get behind that cop car and just follow him wherever he goes," you know. And we got out of there. But we shot this tape. I told them that just when we first arrived there, I just said, you know, follow me, and I'm just going to talk into the microphone, and we're going to go up to each one of these scenes. You know, the guy that was beaten, the lady had a gun on her, and we just talked to all these people. And it was about 20 minutes in the camera, and we took that back and put it on the air. And it was like a little microcosm. All the Fox stations ran it all across the country. And I came into work the next morning, about 5 o'clock in the morning, you know, after being up till like 2 in the morning. And my boss came up to me and he said, "How would you like to meet Rupert Murdoch?" And I went, I didn't know much about Murdoch at that time. And I said, not really, you know. I'm just new here and everything. He goes, "Well, he wants to meet you." And so I go to my boss's office, and he's there with his daughter, Elizabeth, and there's a big plate of bagels there. And he goes, "Have a bagel." And he said, "You know, I'd just like to thank you for all you're doing for us out there," you know. And I thought, it was a pretty nice thing to do, you know. No one at CBS ever said that to me, you know. I guess that maybe was the good part of Rupert Murdoch. But those 3 days of the riots were until you've been through one of those, you know you could maybe die out there, you know. But another amazing thing about it was, you know, the 3 days or so we were in these neighborhoods. I can't remember how many people would come up to us and say, you know, "Thank you for reporting on this. Here, you want some Gatorade? You know, you want a sandwich? You know," and that was, you know, even though the city was burning down, there was still humanity there. You know, there's still good people there. You know, and that's the tragedy of things like that, and the things that we're going through today too. It's just like good people need to take over, you know, because they're out there. But I think sometimes evil people just try harder, You know, good people are just trying to get through the day and do their work, and the evil people are out there manipulating things. And as a news guy, that's your job to point out those bad people. I've always felt that, you know, that I get real satisfaction out of that, you know. You know, whether it's some corporate pig or some bad guy from organized crime, you know, it's really nice to be able to expose those people for what they really are, you know.
Thank you for sharing that incredible history of Los Angeles. We appreciate you being here. Thank you, Mr. Blatchford. I want to backtrack a little bit to first entering Fox 11. Who are some of the, now that the riot is a few weeks away, who are some of the people that you meet at Fox 11? Some of the personalities. Who's there? Who's the anchors?
I mean, I knew them because I'd been working in town for 7 years by then. Chris Harris was the anchor then, and he died, you know, a few years after that. He had heart problems, and he was replaced. They brought John Beard over from Channel, who all Los Angeles people will know. Other people watching this on YouTube won't. But John was an anchor man in this town for 40 years and is really a great guy, really great guy to work with, and I think very well known. I think he had a very unique communication skill. He sort of had a Clark Gable-ish look to him, you know. And he had a wonderful sense of humor, and he also had a great appreciation for what the news should be, and was willing to fight for that. And John was really a great guy, and he was the anchor guy at the time. Yeah.
Was Christine Devine there at the time?
Yes, she was there as well, and she's a very sweet woman, you know. But she was much younger than John and really didn't have the chops yet. But she's a really nice person. And she's really lasted in this town. She's had a great career here. Yeah.
How would you describe your early time at Fox? Was it everything you hoped it would be?
Oh, it was.
Were there any unexpected issues?
It was more than I hoped to be, because, like I say, we were given carte blanche to do almost anything we wanted. There was a producer that I'd worked with at Channel 2 who came over there at the same time. And we were interested in the same kind of things, you know, organized crime and what's happening out in the streets. And so immediately we got together and worked together. And he was a very fearless guy and got us into a lot of situations that could have gotten us killed, I suppose. Certainly got us a lot of death threats over the years. But yeah, those first 5 or 6 years at Fox were the most interesting of my career. I mean, we did a hell of a lot of stuff that nobody else was doing in this town.
Do you recall what was your first story at Fox?
Oh, I really can't remember. You know, there's been so many. People always ask me, what was your favorite story, or what do you remember? And, you know, stories in a way are like children, you know. You wouldn't say you love one more than another.
I'd actually like to start with your coverage of graffiti, if you don't mind. First, how do you get the idea to work on this subject?
Well, I think, you know, most of my ideas just come from, like, and one reason I always like to work a little general assignment too, because you're out in the city and you see things and you talk to people, and that's where you get your ideas, you know. And when we started Fox Undercover, which was our investigative unit, at first it was just our ideas, but then as time went on, people were calling us with stories. You know, because I think when I was at Channel 2, I did a story, an Emmy Award-winning story about aerospace and Northrop Corporation, and they were building the guidance system for the MX missile, and they were putting Radio Shack parts in an MX missile, so if we ever fired that missile, it was just as likely hit Chicago as Moscow, you know. And that was a different kind of reporting. That was like going after a corporation, and that's fun too. And I think, you know, those people like that were corporate executives at a big company like that who have all kinds of money going in a way, they try to go after your job more than the Mexican mafia guys and stuff do, you know. They're big money, and they've got influence, and they come after you, and they try to get your job, you know.
Right. First, I want to ask a really important question. The name, Fox Undercover, who comes up with that name?
God, I can't remember. You know, I just can't remember, but it certainly worked, didn't it?
Yes, it did, definitely.
It became really, I'll tell you, those segments became the the nucleus of Fox success in the 90s. It really did. I mean, they were the #3 station here for years. They didn't have any numbers since George Putnam was the anchorman there, you know, years ahead. And it really gave the signature to that station. And funny because subsequent, you know, starting like in the late 90s, you know, they kissed it off. You know, they had new management come in and they didn't realize what they had, and that was a real tragedy. You know.
When basing your story on graffiti, what were your thoughts on graffiti back then? Because it was in the early beginnings. Was it a nuisance? Were you making the story so law enforcement would crack down on it more?
I mean, we started doing them just because you started seeing it everywhere, and we really didn't understand it, you know, and. When we got into it, you realize, you know, there were just your graffiti guys who were just, you know, scribbling their initials places, and then your piecers who were doing, you know, murals and then beyond that, there were guys who were doing artwork, you know. So I think we kind of defined it for people who didn't know the difference, you know. And I think, you know, like, you know, I met so many of these kids. I mean, some really are gifted artists. And some of them, some of the murals you see in East LA, I mean, those are really, you know, they're really neat. But, you know, the other thing is, I think what a lot of these kids don't understand, they all did it for fame. They'd all talk to you. You know, in the 90s, people just wanted to be famous, you know, and they put their name up or their tagger name or whatever. And it was all just about fame. And they all weren't artists, you know. But for the guys who were really into the art, I get it. But, you know, if you're a hard-working guy, a bus driver, and you live in Compton or something, and you got a couple kids, and you bought this house, and some guy's graffitiing all over your house, I mean, you know, that's not right, you know, and that, you know, a kid doesn't understand, you know, a man works hard to build a life and everything, and then some kid comes along and ruins the neighborhood with a bunch of graffiti and everything. It's just, it shouldn't be tolerated, I don't think, you know.
How do you begin your journalistic process to covering the story? How do you go out and find the writers to interview? How do you get them to trust you?
Oh boy, I mean, sometimes you just show up in the neighborhood and just start talking to people, and they'll say, hey, you know, so-and-so hangs out here, there. And then, you know, as we really got going though, I mean, people would call up and they'd say, you know, like, can you come to our neighborhood? This is happening here, there, you know. And that, a lot of our stories just came from call-ins at that point, you know. And then we had a couple of guys we hired, you know, that were like in their early 20s or so, who grew up in those neighborhoods. And sometimes we'd send them with a camera, you know, at first, and then we'd come later. But, you know, it got to be when I'd show up at a party crew party or a tag banger place, I mean, they all knew who I was, you know. So, I mean, I didn't get a lot of bad reception, you know. And I think they sort of understood what I was doing, I think, you know. And, yeah, I mean, there were some scary times, too. I mean, you'd show up somewhere and there'd be some really hardcore gangsters there who wouldn't want you there, you know. I remember once in El Monte we showed up and there was a Mexican mafia guy there. And there were some really bad actors and a gang there. And I lost my photographer, you know. And I look over in the corner and like he's surrounded by these guys, about 5 guys. And I went up to them and I said, hey, what's going on or something? And they said, what are you doing here or something? Well, it was a party crew guy who invited us to the party, but you know, it happened to be in gang territory, so they all showed up. And I just said, hey man, and I made the mistake of putting my hand on the guy's shoulder, and he's like, you know, like I shouldn't have touched him. I said, you know, if you don't want us here, you know, we're leaving, you know. And we turned around and we left, you know. But later on, I got to know the Mexican mafia guy who was coming to that party, and he was laughing at me. He said, yeah, you left there, out of there. And I said, with your tail between your legs? I said, no, we just left, you know. I said, I know when I'm not wanted, you know. I'm not going to get in a fight with 8 guys with knives and guns in their pockets. I'm not that stupid.
When the newsroom hears you're making a story about graffiti and all the dangers that might entail, does anyone try to talk you out of it?
No, No one ever tried to talk us out of it. A lot of people thought I was kind of crazy, you know. They used to joke about, some guys used to call me Dr. Death and other nicknames like that, you know, because of the stuff that we did. But, you know, this is going to sound really corny, you know, but I mean, I grew up with an Irish Catholic mother, you know. I went to Catholic elementary school, and I always just figured this is going to sound really stupid to a lot of people. I always felt I'm kind of doing God's work, you know. I always, even if I was talking to bad people, I always tried to point out, you know, that this isn't the right thing to do. I always hoped that, you know, the pieces that people did see would, you know, if they're sitting there with their parents, they'd go, you know, you don't want to end up like that, you know. I mean, I always thought that, I'm not a super religious guy, but I always thought if I was trying to do the right thing, that God would take care of me. And if there is a God up there, he always did and continues to. Yeah.
Were you happy with your final reports on graffiti? Is there anything that you had to leave out that you wish would have stayed in?
No, I think, you know, we covered it pretty broadly, you know, the whole graffiti thing. I remember there was one kid who was actually sentenced to jail for his graffiti, and I remember covering his court case, and he was really angry with us, you know, that, and his mother was, that he was going to go off to jail for a couple of years. But, you know, he'd graffitied all over the place, you know. But, you know, I felt kind of badly for that kid. But I mean, you know, sometimes when you're a news guy, you just have to do the story, and then let the chips fall where they may. I mean, I wish I could give you an example, but there's a few times in my life that I didn't do a story or something because I was worried, you know, that it might hurt somebody or anything. But maybe that's a mistake, maybe. I mean, you know, you're supposed to put the problem out there, and then maybe a smarter guy than me can figure out what to do about it, or at least people start talking about it, and then it gets fixed. I don't think it's the news guy's job to really fix it. It's our job to tell people what's going on, and then people who have the responsibility to fix it should fix it. And I think that's the one thing that the news should do, is really point out what's going on. You know, that's their main job. You know, even when it's good things. Yeah.
When the special premieres on television, do you watch it? Do you watch your own work?
No, I never do. You know, when I sit in an edit room, say I'm editing a 5-minute piece, you know, that'll take all day, maybe 2 days sometimes. And by the time it hits the air, I'm sick of seeing it, you know. But I'll tell you what I did do sometimes. And even when, you know, occasionally, I still love to go out and do like a light feature once in a while too, you know, because you meet a different kind of people. And every once in a while, like if I knew a piece was going to play on the TV, I would stand outside in the hall just to listen to what the reaction was from my peers, you know, just to get that kind of feedback that, you know, whether they're lying or crying or whatever, you know. I remember, you know, during the Iraqi war, we had the managing editor at Channel 11 for many years was a guy named Larry Croner, who was the best executive I've ever worked for in my life, you know. And he decided, like, when we should do a story about every kid from LA who was killed in the Iraqi war. We're going to do a story about every one. So I did a whole bunch of them, you know. And that was interesting too, you know, because only one house we showed up and they sort of, what are you doing here? Get out of here. But all these people, they appreciated that you wanted to tell the story about their son and what a wonderful guy he was or whatever, you know. And those stories are really satisfying too, you know. But I brought that up because, like, I remember Larry, the managing editor, told me one day this piece I did with this kid. His dad was a minister, and they were out from the San Bernardino area somewhere, and I interviewed him, and he said, yeah, like, you know, when that piece ran, you could hear a pin drop in the newsroom. Everybody listened, you know. And so sometimes I would like to be outside the room and just hear the reaction, you know. It's sort of the fruits of your labor. You can get that feedback. Yeah.
What were the ratings like for your features? Would you guys check the ratings? Would you get any feedback?
You know, I never checked the ratings, but the guys I worked with, like the producers and stuff, they'd always come tell me usually, because they'd always check, but I never checked them, you know. But I'll tell you, the ratings for all the stuff we did, in the trade they call it popping a number. Like say the show starts at a 6 rating, and your piece comes on for 5 minutes, and it goes up to an 8 or a 9, or But I never check the ratings.
So the newsroom does know when a story comes on if it pops or not.
Yeah.
Or if it underperforms.
Yes. Yeah. The way the ratings work today, they can tell you almost to the minute who's watching.
Oh, wow. Thank you.
How many people are watching.
After your report on graffiti airs, do you get any backlash? Does the mayor call you? Does the police officers, why are you promoting graffiti? Do you get any kind of
I think we got an award from the transit service with RTD, and they gave us an award because they said we're the first person to actually define what is happening. These kids were doing all the buses and the bus benches and things like that. And I remember they said that we were the first people who really explained what was going on with the graffiti,
Definitely. You unlocked a whole subculture to many people in LA. First of all, what I want to ask you, do you still keep track of graffiti these days? Do you have any favorite graffiti writers?
No, I really don't. I really don't.
Do you know the names of any graffiti writers?
Not today, I don't, no.
Are you surprised by the influence that your stories have had on well-known graffiti writers?
I don't know. I don't think I'm really aware of that, because they don't call me. Somebody, you tell me that, but I don't really know that. Did it happen?
I mean, it feels like everyone's watched your specials.
Yeah.
We know names like Chaka and Euler are legendary because they appeared on your specials.
Yeah.
It feels like your specials kind of bred a new generation of writers and influenced the culture more, gave it history, and
that's interesting because you see that because you probably maybe grew up around some of those guys, but those guys never came back to me to tell me any of that. I really don't know what happened to them beyond the stories that we did.
Maybe it's just me and my friends and my family who are influenced like that by you. But through all the comments on YouTube, Instagram, there's thousands of people who say the same.
I'd say I get people coming up to me frequently saying, because of those stories you did, I became a cop, or because of those stories you did, I left the gang. That happened with frequency. I don't know if that answers your question, but
yes, both sides of the coin, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on graffiti these days? How far it's come? It's on billboards now. Companies use it for marketing. It's everywhere.
Well, I think one of the good things that came out of that whole party crew thing and the graffiti thing is there are kids who found a vocation out of it. And I think probably somebody got a hold of them. Who knew that? There's like Lowrider magazine. Some of those guys did cartoons for that and everything. I mean, it did open up. The good side of that was the guys who were really serious about it. Some of them made careers out of it, and even the party crew guys. I mean, some of them. I got a call a couple of years ago from a guy. He said all these guys that were party crew guys out in the San Bernardino area. They started a bonding business. But they learned their entrepreneurial skills putting on those parties and everything. He just called to thank me one day. This was just a couple of years ago,
Definitely. We were into party crews too. And we thank you for your new specials because that's kind of why we started our own party crew. We were younger. We were the younger generation.
Yeah.
So
but definitely some good commerce came out of that. I mean, some kids learned some good lessons about being businessmen.
Definitely, being business-minded.
And being artists.
Renting a place, charging people, promotion, marketing, all that stuff.
Yeah. I think, what the graffiti guys had to learn, though, too, is as I mentioned before, I mean, if I've got a house, I don't want you putting graffiti on my house, or even if I have a business. But there might be a guy with a market who would love a nice mural on the side and even pay you to do it. And I think some of these guys who continue with the graffiti and had success with that realized that, and maybe they were approached by people. I remember Gloria Molina. I was at a supervisor's meeting one day, and they had a graffiti guy testifying there. I can't remember his name. And she said, if you want to do graffiti, if you want to do artwork, she said, you come to me. I will find you a place where you can have all the graffiti you want, in an industrial area. And she said, I'm just telling you, don't do it on people's neighborhoods and on their homes. And I thought she was right about that, I think, And I think a lot, and I think, and you know this better than I do, there were guys who did that, I think. And some of them went on to make a living with their art.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Many have gone on to be legends in their own field of art. Now, in more recent news, I want to talk to you about the ocean-wide towers in downtown Los Angeles, which made headlines all over the world this year. Did you hear about the ocean-wide towers?
I read about it in the paper.
And what did you think about them when you saw?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of sad. There's just an empty building sitting there and all that wasted space and money. But I mean, I can see why the kids, they're not all kids though. A lot of these guys are in their 30s that do this graffiti. I can see why they did it, I don't have any strong feelings about that one way or the other. I think it's going to be an eyesore if nobody buys that building and fixes it up. I mean, it's going to become a place for transients to hang out and drug dealing to go on, and that's the sad part of that story, So I don't know what do you do with it now. There's so much money down the drain already. You're going to require some big company to come in or something. And
if Chris Blatchford was back at Fox News, would he be covering the ocean-wide towers?
Yeah, sure you would. Yeah, sure you would.
How many of those writers on the ocean-wide towers do you think know who Chris Blatchford is?
I would have no idea on that, Do you think they'd know?
Yes, I believe they would. Why do you think graffiti isn't as much as a priority these days as it was back in your era?
I think it's like anything that's new. When something's new, everybody jumps on the boat. And then as time goes on, fashion's like that too, You move on to something else, and the people really serious about it stick with it. Everybody else just sort of falls off, like any fad. Like in the 20s and 30s, people swallowing goldfish, I mean, they did that for a few years, and then you don't see people swallowing goldfish today.
What are your thoughts on Instagram pages and YouTube channels dedicated to the cultures you helped bring to the forefront, like Party Cruise, graffiti, the lowrider scene? Were you ahead of your time?
I mean, you'd have to say that, I can't really say that, I don't think. I'd like to take credit for anything good that came out of that.
Are you properly credited for bringing these stories to the masses, even influencing these genres to become bigger?
I'm the wrong guy to ask that, I think. You'd have to ask people who are actually influenced by it, I can't sit here and toot my own horn on that because I really don't know that for a fact.
You mentioned receiving an award from the Rapid Transit District. Can you describe what bus mobbing was like back in those days, or taggers
the bus mobbing,
vandalizing buses? Can you describe what that era was like?
Oh yeah, it was happening daily. These kids would get off school and get their crew together and just go grab a bus, And as bad as it may sound, I can see how they got excited about it. They're like stuck on the back of a bus with this can and everything. They're getting away with it. I mean, the kids that I met doing that really weren't bad kids, It's just like, it's probably like kids in the country that go tipping over cows, That was their thing at the time. But the bottom line is, it costs the city a lot of money, and you can't just let that go. It's just like, this is off the subject completely, but I remember sitting in a room in San Diego with 6 DEA agents, and they were angry that with the Reagan administration did this Just Say No to Drugs and the war on drugs. They said that, we're never going to eliminate the drug problem and drug trade. He said, we're just like the boy with his finger in the dike, We're not going to, and they were all Republicans probably, but they were mad at the Reagans for giving this false expectation that this thing could be conquered, because they know it's impossible. I mean, it's $1 billion business involving thousands of people, and it's just, they can't stop it. They can't stop it. And that's the same thing with the graffiti. I mean, you can't completely stop it, but it does cost the public millions of dollars a year cleaning up off after all this stuff, So you can't encourage it, I don't think,
I'm not sure if the RTD, Metro, or LAPD creates a unit called the Ghost Team. the Graffiti Habitual Offender Suppression Team. Have you ever heard of the GHOST team?
Well, I know that there was, I don't know what was called the GHOST team, but there was definitely a crew in the sheriff's department that worked exclusively trying to get guys that were at the top of the graffiti thing at the time. And I did a couple stories with them. They started calling me because they wanted the publicity about their crew because they wanted funding to stop the graffiti, you know. And I get that from their angle too, you know. So they gave me a handful of stories at least that, you know, I can't remember what they called themselves.
Right. In that era, as you mentioned, the GHOST team was locking up vandals for 5, sometimes even for 10 years for graffiti. Do you think the penalty was too harsh for writers back then, being sentenced to prison with murderers?
That's a tough question to answer, you know. I think that's just a really tough question to answer. You know, if I'm a judge hearing that case, I want to know about this kid. I want to know what kind of family he's from. I want to know what kind of future he might have. If I send him to prison, can I help him? Will prison help him? Prison might, you know, I worked with a photographer for years who got into drugs as a teenager and did 6 months in county jail for selling drugs. This would have been in the 80s. And it turned his life around. You know, he became a photographer, a really good one. He made a good living, and so I mean, jail can turn somebody around, but it can also make somebody just worse. I'm glad I don't have to make those decisions about those kids, but yeah, before I sentenced anybody to prison, I would want to know all about their background. And I mean, is this just an incorrigible, incurable person who's just doing this to destroy other people's property? Or is this an aspiring young artist who just, you know, needed a canvas to write on and didn't really understand what he was doing? I don't think prison's going to do that guy any good, you know. There's other ways of turning his life around. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you. I also want to know, as a professional investigative reporter, how would you begin finding out about the GHOST team if someone wanted to research about that tactical unit? Because we've called LAPD searching for any information on the GHOST team, and they tell us they'll look into it, they'll get it back to us, but then they refuse to share any information about it when they get back to us.
I think you have to understand, as you know, I was a reporter here for 30 years, so I mean, there were guys when I started as a reporter here that were young cops that eventually became, you know, head of units, and you know, even one became chief that I knew was a young guy. So, what was your question again? I'm sorry, I lost my thought.
We've tried, as a professional investigative reporter, how can we find out more info on the GHOST team when it feels like the LAPD is stonewalling us?
It's very different for me because, I mean, you know, cops too all knew I do all these stories. So, I mean, they would approach me with that. I think that I don't know if that was the GHOST team at the time, but they called me and said, you know, would you like to do some stories? We're trying to, you know, crack down on this. And they were good stories, you know, and so it was a little different from me from that angle. I had access in a lot of these areas with police that the average reporter wouldn't have. I knew a lot of these cops for years. I think they viewed a lot. It's funny, they viewed a lot of what I did being good for them. And in some cases it was. There were stories that we did that I know that the sheriff started task forces, you know. There were certain areas where there were gang murders going on, and we did stories about that. Then the sheriff would make a task force of like 6, 12 officers, you know, and they'd work that. So, I mean, from the smart cops know that the newsman can be your friend, you know, because, you know, they want to work certain things. They've got bosses that tell them what to do. They love to have proof of what's going on to influence their boss's decisions on what they might do and what kind of money they might get to work certain crimes, you know. So, yeah, the newsman can be a cop's friend, you know. It's kind of sad that some cops don't understand that. I think they see the news as the enemy, but really, if they work it right, it's their friend.
Thank you. Makes sense. You have special connections and you're well known already. Now, another story you cover was the tag banging era in graffiti. When do you first hear about taggers shooting each other?
I don't know when we first heard about it, but it might have been one night I can't remember where the area was, but we were shooting a tagger, and he actually got shot at, And I think that was sort of the genesis of us looking into tag bangers. We'd not seen that kind of violence with taggers before. And then, like I said, we had a couple young guys that sort of worked the streets for us too, always telling us. And we really did. We were the first, I think, to report on the tag banger thing. And that was really sad too, because, like you have these kids that were taggers. Some of them were, decent kids. They just didn't understand, I think, that they're damaging people's property or anything. But all of a sudden, they're in gang areas. And, you can't tag in a gang area because that gang is the only person tagging there, And we were out one night and the gangster shot at this tagger. And I think that's where we sort of took it seriously. And we started hooking up with some of these tag banger crews, And I think even the police at that time didn't understand what a tag banger was. I think we were the first people to really identify that. And the sad part about that is like, a lot of these guys who just got into graffiti, all of a sudden, your friend's shot at or something, and then you start carrying a gun, then you shoot somebody, and the next thing you know, you're a gangster. And the next thing you know, you're in prison. And that's just like, violence begets violence, and it's just, that's the sad part of all this stuff,
As you're doing your story about tag banging, are you out with the writers? Are they showing you their guns? Are you surprised by how many guns are out there?
There's always a gun in a crew. And, whether it's a tag banger crew or a gangster, there's always somebody in that crew who has a gun. It's my understanding. I mean, that's always, and the really hardcore ones are maybe more than one person with a gun. But there's always a guy carrying a gun,
In the 90s,
in my experience, there's always some guy with a gun. Yeah.
In the 90s, it seems like it was a more violent era. And having a gun was more of a fashion statement, would you say? Would you agree with that?
Well, I think, I think that what was the LAPD movie about?
Colors?
Colors. I think Colors had a great influence at the time on gang growth, not only in Los Angeles, but across the country. That had a lot of influence, I think, on, there's like 18th Street's a gang that was born here, White Fence. I mean, you go back to Chicago now, there's an 18th Street. There might be one in New York. I mean, or MS-13 is even a better example. I mean, they're all over the country now. And some of these kids would, they weren't from here. They just heard the name on a TV show or in the movie Colors, the Crips and Bloods thing. They just picked that. There's Crips in little towns in Indiana, and they just saw it in the movies.
Do you know where the term tag banging came from? Many people say Fox News coined it. What are your thoughts on the word tag banging, and where do you first hear it?
Yeah, we didn't make that up. I mean, it came as a surprise to us when we first went out there, and we knew that these shootings were happening, and somebody told us that now there are tag bangers. And I remember going to a meeting. There was even we had that in a story. It got so out of hand, like there were like 10 crews or so that had a peace meeting, to try to control what was going on because they were worried about it, It's funny, I mean, these tagger guys, they were so into it, it's like you're a football player in high school and that becomes your whole life. For these kids, it was tagging, and it gave them fame and notoriety in their own minds. And they ran away with it, and it ran away with their lives at the time. And the unfortunate part of this, really, when you see kids that are 12 or 14 and they're shooting somebody or they're dead, I mean, I can't tell you how many homes I've been into talking to a mother or father who was a dead kid, I mean, it's heart-wrenching. It's heart-wrenching. Remember, I saw that so much that we finally did a series called Moms and Gangs, And I remember sitting in this room with like a dozen mothers who all had their sons killed, It all broke up their marriages, everything. And I remember I couldn't talk. you know. It's like I was earlier in this interview. My throat got restricted, and my eyes started to well up because there's just so much pain in that room, you know. To lose a child, and to lose a child who's 12 years old or 14 years old because he was shot and killed by some. It's inconceivable if you're a father or a mother to imagine that happening. You know, it's what a waste. You know. It's more, you know, if your son died in battle in Vietnam or Afghanistan or something, you know, you could at least rationalize it was for some cause and he was trying to do something. But on the streets of LA, you know, tagging a wall and you get killed or walking in the wrong neighborhood, I mean, it's just, you know, it's a tragedy and it's a sickness, you know. And ever since I came from this town, every new mayor always talks about, you know, we're going to get control of the gang thing and everything, and no one ever does. No one ever does. And part of the reason is, in the neighborhoods where this happens, you know, when the cops show up there, you know, well, they're harassing their kids, but, you know, why are you harassing my kids? Well, because they're in a gang, you know. And then the cops become the bad guys, but really they're just trying to clean things up, you know. And it's a rough cycle that just goes on and on and on, and nobody ever seems to fix it, you know. And I think a lot of it has to come from the people who live in those neighborhoods. But then you've got to understand too that there are people in those neighborhoods who want to fight it, and some of them are threatened with their lives, you know. And then they've got I can go home every night, you know. But if you're living in a neighborhood that's controlled by a gang, you know, you could get shot for some stupid thing, you know. So it's a really rough problem, and I don't know how you really fix it. Maybe you should almost teach it in the schools, you know.
At the height of the tag banging era, word comes down, I'm not sure from where, but word comes down that taggers must now join gangs or they have the green light. Do you hear about this rumor? Yeah. And what are your thoughts about it?
Yeah, no.
Where does it originate from?
We heard that too. You know, that the gangs didn't want the tag bangers. You had to either join the gang and quit the tag banger thing. But you know what happened though? In some cases, the tag bangers became more violent than the gang, and they kicked the gang out of the neighborhood. I can think of 2 incidents of that happening, you know, and that the tag banger guys became violent. And I think that, you know, as the tag banger phenomena became more and more violent, they needed more violent guys in it, you know, from that. And some of the guys who were in the street gang there became tag bangers. And then the names were kind of neater too, the tag bangers, than the gang name, you know. There's a sexier name than 18th Street, you know. A lot of the names were quite creative, yeah.
Definitely. In your opinion, why does tag banging die out? It seems like past the 2000s, it's not as deadly in the streets anymore.
I think tag banging petered out because you had to become a gang member. If you were going to be violent, you had to be in the gang, you know. And I think that there was no in between anymore. You were either a tagger or a gang member. And I think that the Mexican mafia got involved in that at the time too. You know, you had to be, if you're in that neighborhood, you had to be in the gang. You know, they weren't putting up with taggers either. They didn't really. And you know, I'll tell you, if you're a Mexican mafia guy and your mom lives in the East Side and some guy's tagging her garage, you know, he's mad about that. You know, even though he's sitting in Pelican Bay, you know, but he's sending out the word, you know, no more tagging there. You know, it's all connected.
Another story you cover, which had a huge influence on us, was ditching parties, where hundreds of teenagers would break into warehouses or sometimes have parties in someone's backyard during school hours, most likely at 10 a.m. Can you talk about first hearing about ditching parties? How does it catch your attention?
You know, I think, you know, like by that time we did have a couple guys, you know, who grew up in those areas who were shooting some video for us. I mean, they told us what was going on, but we could just see it evolving too. You know, the sad part about those parties, like at 10 o'clock in the morning, I mean, I've been there when 16-year-old kids are drunk at noon, you know, and they just didn't know what they're getting into, you know, or they should. I remember talking to one guy one day, and I go, "What are you doing here?" And he was drunk. He was probably about 16, and he goes, "Well, yeah, school's no fun, you know. I don't want to go to school." I said, "Well, school wasn't exactly fun for me either." But he said, "Well, you don't learn anything." I said, "Yeah, but are you trying to learn anything? You're here at the party, you know." And he goes, "Well, yeah." I said, "Well, you know," but he said, "They don't teach us." And I go, "Well," I said, "You've got to be there for them to teach you, you know." I said, like, and you've got to make an effort. You know, they don't pour knowledge into your ear with a horn or something, you know. It's something that you need to work at, you know. And he's sort of like, "Oh, yeah, I guess so," you know. But I mean, you know, and the bottom line for all this stuff, education's the key. I mean, you know, if you want to get out of a bad situation, you know, I can find somebody from almost any walk of life, and they made it. You know, and the key was education, you know. I remember getting a call once from a guy, and he wanted me to come out in the San Bernardino area somewhere. He was a Mexican mafia associate, probably in his 40s, and he'd just gotten out of prison, and he wanted to work towards some peace in the neighborhood where he grew up, and he thought boxing would be a good way. So he was staging these boxing matches between rival gangs, you know. So we went out there and we covered it, and it turned out to be a nice story. You know, there were rival gangs there, and they were boxing each other. But I remember sitting next to a 15, 16-year-old kid, and he was drunk out of his mind, you know. And he was a sweet kid, you could tell, though. And he sought me out, you know. And I remember I was sitting on like a sort of a pile of bricks on the side of this patio. And he said, "Can I talk to you, Mr. He called me Mr. Blatchford, I remember. And I said, "Sure you can," you know. He said, "You know, like, my dad's in prison, and I can't remember what for, and my mom is a heroin addict." And he said, I just don't know what to do, you know. And I'm in this gang thing. And I just felt so badly for him. And I like, what do you do with a kid like that, you know? I mean, he was reaching out, and there's thousands of kids out there like that, you know. And I don't know what the answers are, but there's got to be a way to reach these kids. And I remember just telling them, you know, something that probably seems pretty empty, that, you know, you can shape your own life, you know. I said, first of all, you don't have to be drinking out here, you know, and you don't really have to be a member of the gang, you know. And but I remember he was a sweet kid, you know, a little guy, you know. He was in one of the boxing matches, but he was looking for advice, you know, and he didn't have a father figure, you know, or a mother, you know. And like, it's just, most people don't see that. That's another thing I think you get to see as a news guy, you know, even if you didn't grow up in that kind of life. Although I could relate to it, I had an alcoholic father, you know, but you know, I hate this thing today, fake news, you know. It's just because, you know, good news people out there, they do know what's going on, and they are telling the truth. And that's not to say, you know, there's not some bad news people or anything, but, you know, it should all be about the truth, you know.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm not sure if this will help anyone, but we had a cousin who was heavily involved in gangs and even homeless for a while. And he actually went to Homeboy Industries with the father there. His name skips my mind.
Father Boyle.
Yeah, but our cousin passed away, and Father Boyle was there for his eulogy. Yeah. And he really cares. And if anyone needs help trying to get out of that lifestyle, try to check into Homeboy Industries and give that a look.
He's done a wonderful thing. I know him pretty well.
Thank you for sharing all those great words, man. I appreciate it.
It's funny, you know, Father Boyle came here about the same time I did, and he's very liberal, and he was like, you know, behind the Salvadoran immigrants when they came, and he was going to do these new, and he's sort of finding his mission, and then he found this Homeboy thing, and it's been a remarkable achievement.
Definitely doing great work. Now, I want to go back to the ditching parties. Why do you think that era ended? It seems that we don't see ditching parties as prevalent now as they were back in the day.
I think, well, I don't know. I told you when we were talking before, I had a kid come up to me one day and said that you destroyed the party scene, you know. And from the stories we did, I think parents started, and I had calls from parents once in a while. you know, some of the girls were stripping at these parties. And I remember there was this girl who was kicked out of high school in her senior year because she talked on camera about them stripping at parties. And forgive me for laughing, but I look back on it now. And, you know, that's just some, you know, drinking, drugs, young girls stripping for, you know, it's just something somebody 14, 15, 16 years old shouldn't be doing. It's not going to help them move forward in life anyway. Does that answer your question, though?
Yes, as you mentioned, besides ditching parties and party crews, there were the party girls. Yeah. Another famous story you did, where teenage girls would go out and dance wearing revealing clothes, almost next to nothing. Do you recall the way these young girls were dressing? And what kind of feedback were you getting after running the story?
Well, that's why I got a call.
Because all these were underage girls, right?
Yeah, yeah. I remember one beautiful young girl. She was like 15, and her boyfriend was the head of one of these party crews, and he made her do it, and he was like 18, you know. Yeah, it was sad, I think, you know. Like I told you, I got a call from a mother one day saying, you know, we had an interview with a girl talking about stripping at these parties, and I think she was in a Catholic high school, and they wouldn't let her graduate, you know, and I felt kind of badly about that, but then again, I remember telling the mother, well, this could be a good lesson for her, too, down the line, you know.
What was everyone's reaction in the newsroom when you talk about this story coming up? Does anyone try to talk you out of it?
No, nobody tried to talk us out of it. We had pretty good free reign. Our boss at the time was a good guy, and he realized that it was helping his career as well. And that we were making good decisions, you know. But, you know, like, the other thing is, too, like, every story we did was highly scrutinized. I mean, after I write a story, you know, I'd go over it with the guy who, if I had a producer on, I didn't always have a producer, but, you know, getting his input, and then we'd take that script to a managing editor, and he reads it, and then the news director will read it after him, and then we go, and if there's questions about things, you take it to a lawyer, and then when the show producer gets it for them, you know, they have questions too, you know. So it's not like we just can do it without any supervision at all. All this stuff was highly vetted before we put it on the air. And there were some things that, you know, like they'd make us cover up people's faces that were juvenile sometimes. I remember doing a thing about junkies, and they made us, you know, junkie puts a needle in his arm and blood comes out. You know, they made us cover up the blood. And I remember doing a thing about street racing once, and there was a kid killed, and we had a shot of his sort of head hanging out, and they wanted us to cover them. But I always argued, you're going to think I'm a terrible person, but I always said that we should show the worst of it. Because, you know, during the Iraqi war, what was it, 92 or whatever, there was a guy named Sabi Sabtai. He was an Israeli Mossad, and he came here to help with the movie business. And I remember during that 9/11, I called him and asked if he'd come on the set to talk with our anchor people, you know, and he said, no, I'm not going to do anything like that with American media anymore. He said, because, like, you know, there's people jumping out of buildings and dying because of that, in the Twin Towers. I mean, he said, and you're not showing it in America. He said, in Israel, we would show that, and we would show the results of the violence. And he said, you too often in America homogenize it, you know, and that doesn't help anything. And I always, you know, before I had that conversation with him, I always made that argument too, you know. I said, it may be hurtful for this family, but what's the greater good there, you know? And it's a tough decision. I remember this producer I worked with for years, we were talking about something like this one day, and we were going back and forth, should we do that? And he looked at me and he went, it's not easy being God, is it? That always stuck in my mind. That's true, because, and you do have to remember that as a news person, you know. What you do is going to really affect somebody's life. So you better be right. And, you know, sometimes you do make the wrong decision, I guess, and somebody suffers. But sometimes somebody has to maybe suffer for a better purpose. You know, they did it, we didn't. You know, But it's a hard decision to make.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I want to go back. I know it sounds trivial going back to
The taggers again?
yeah, to party girls actually, but
Well, you know, the party girls, not all the girls stripped and stuff, just, you know, just a few of them did in each crew, I think. And it depended on the crew, too. I mean, some of these parties were really more about debauchery than others, you know. It depended on who the crew was and who was running the crew. It's like anything, you know, any profession, anything, you know, there's people who are good and there are people bad in every profession. I think even the party crew scene, there were some like, you know, fresh-faced kids who just want to have a good time, and there was others that were quasi-gangsters, you know.
Mr. Blatchford, I actually have a whole section coming up called Conspiracy Theories, where I'm going to talk about 9/11. So I just want to save that for a while while we focus on these party girls.
Okay.
Now, I want to ask you, do you know that there's Instagram accounts and YouTube channels dedicated to ditching parties and the way these girls dressed back in the day? Most famously, an Instagram page called Rucas and Veteranas and Map Points. Are you aware that this era is being romanticized now?
No, I'm not. You know, I mean, you know, I've been retired for like 8 years, and that's all in my rearview mirror now. I think, you know, I'm not really up on what's happening today in that scene.
There's a curator called Guadalupe Rosales who's going all over around the country showing flyers, pictures of the party crews and the ditching parties back in the era, trying to bring it to the forefront and let everyone know about hidden LA culture.
Are they using our stuff? Or
No, it's actually flyers that we gave her and other party promoters for pictures and all that stuff.
Well, you know, you asked before how we knew about a lot of this stuff. I mean, once we got into it, you know, we got the flyers, and the flyers would tell you where everything was.
Yes, definitely. Actually, on the flyers, if you remember, it was all young girls dressed in provocative outfits.
Yeah.
How do you think flyers like that would do in this age?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. I'll tell you that there was I think she was a sociology professor at UCLA who called up. I think we found her, and we asked her that question about young girls doing this and being in these crews and everything. She was Latina, and she was really against it. She said, you know, really these girls shouldn't be doing this, and I would urge them to, you know, stop what they're doing and not being involved in this, that there's much better things for them to be doing with their lives. And, you know, some of the things that they might find embarrassing 10 years from now, they could avoid by not doing it, you know. But you know, that scene, I can't really talk with any knowledge about what's happening today.
Do you consider any of these eras that I mentioned before, do you consider these eras to be part of Los Angeles history? What do they mean to you? Are they just news stories you covered?
You guys were telling me, you know, you watched this guys when what you were in high school, watching the stuff that I did. I mean, so, you know, there's no question that it had an impact. I mean, I have people, you know, throughout my career coming up to me on the streets. I mean, whether it be some kid that got out of a gang or some guy who became a cop, or so I know those stories have had an influence. You know, I'm not so sure the people that I worked for really understood how much influence it had, and that's one reason it trailed off, I think. You know, you know, it's funny too. You know, obviously you can tell I'm a white guy. You know, and you know, when we first started doing some of this stuff, I had some calls like, you know, like, you're xenophobic or whatever. But, you know, that didn't last that long because, you know, we did stories about white supremacists, white gangs, we did Latino gangs, we did Mexican mafia, we did Russian mafia. I mean, we did everything really, you know. So it really wasn't xenophobic. It was just like, I remember this one little girl telling me one day, she said, why do you always do all, and this was during the party crew area, why do you always do these things like making Latino kids look bad, you know, and everything? And I'm going, well, you know, you're 80% of the population. And I said, so it's sort of hard not to. I said, if I go to these parties, who's there? And I said, it's Latino. And she said, oh, I never thought of that, you know, but, you know, it was never intended to be racial in any way. It's just like what was going on in the city at the time, you know. And obviously, the Spanish-speaking community has tremendous influence in Los Angeles, you know. And to ignore that, you know, as a news guy, you're really not doing your job, I don't think, you know.
Another great story you covered, which brought this subculture to my attention, was Asian gangs. To me, you were the first investigative reporter to cover Asian gangs and the violence. Can you talk about that subject?
Yeah, I mean, the Asian gangs became just as prolific as any others. Some even took the name Crip to be in their gang, you know. They did all the same things that any other gang does. I think that one unique thing about Asian gangs was, though, I mean, normally, you know, if you're talking about a black gang or a Latino gang or even a white supremacist gang in Orange County, these guys all grew up in the same neighborhood and knew each other. I lost my thought again, what we were talking about with the Asian gang. Oh, one thing that's very different about the Asian gangs opposed to black gangs or white supremacist gangs or Latino gangs is they had a lot of crossover socioeconomically. Like normally, you know, if you're going to a Latino neighborhood, everybody's, you know, lower class, lower middle class, or middle class, and the same thing in black neighborhood. But you would have kids in San Marino that were living in mansions, hooking up with kids who lived in like a trailer in Rosemead or something, and they were all coming together in the same gang, which was very different. You know, it was much more inclusive in their economic and social group. You know, and you didn't see that in any other gangs. You know.
How are you made aware that there's a growing Asian gang culture at the time?
That's a good question. There was a guy who was a probation officer who was Asian, who became a good contact of mine. And I think after we did our first Asian gang thing, he started feeding us a lot of material. But I'll tell you, I think the first Asian gang stories we did, there was a guy who ran the gang unit in the sheriff's office in the organized crime division. And it was just him and another officer. And he saw all this happening with Asian boys. There were like 13 murders in like a short period of time. And he called me, I knew him. And he said, Chris, you've got to do a story about these Asian boys, you know. So we did a story, and he opened the books for us. And they added 6 guys to his unit after that. And then LAPD then got involved, and they formed an even bigger unit that worked for like 3 or 4 years that was just tied to Asian gangs. And they put a lot of those guys in jail, and I think that they retarded the Asian gang movement a little bit at that time, you know. But I say you never completely wipe any of this stuff out.
Right. The Asian Boys were one of the most brutal Asian gangs in Los Angeles at the time. I believe they started a trend called doming, which was they'd walk up to your enemy and shoot them in the head, point blank range. Do you recall that?
Yeah, they were really brutal. I think, you know, these were guys that actually trained. One of them had some property up in Central California, the dad in Taft, and they would go up there with their cars, and they set up barrels and a house, and they would actually practice drive-bys on these barrels and in this house. And one of them was in the Navy, and he even had like naval armed tactics that they were using. And they were much more sophisticated in their approach. They would have like a trail car, you know, that would come by and finish people off. I mean, they really were organized. They turned into organized killers rather than just random drive-bys. They planned this stuff out, and they worked at it, and they practiced it. And I'd never seen anything like that before.
Besides the Asian Boys, you also cover gang life in the streets of Los Angeles. Most notably, your story on Chucky and Midget from Tortilla Flats. Do you recall that story?
Oh yeah, that story I think had more reactions from people than anything I've ever done.
What were your thoughts when you first saw the 2 young men?
Very sad, you know, very sad. I mean, the first night I met them, there was a Compton police officer who told us about these 2 young kids in Tortilla Flats gang. and they were just like 8 and 12, I think, at the time. And I went down there by myself one night with a photographer, and they had absconded a house that was like their fort, and there was graffiti all over. And I spent like a couple hours there, and they were shooting at cars going by in the streets. And my reaction was just, I mean, I'd seen a lot of gang stuff by then, but I just thought, these poor kids, you know, they don't get it. They don't get where this life is going to take them, you know. And I remember just thinking, this is going to be an important story, because this is happening with thousands of kids in Los Angeles, you know. And I don't think anybody who matters, who could do something about it, is even aware of it. But this one cop did, from Compton. He got it, you know. And he saw a lot. He was a Compton cop for like 20 years or something. And he knew this story would be powerful, and it was. And actually, I had a long relationship with one of those characters in there, Midget, who eventually went to prison for life. But even while he was in prison, I was in contact with him for years after that, you know. And he's another one where he was smart, and he had personality, and, you know, given a different life, he could have been something, you know. It's sad. He had charisma, you know, but he ended up in prison for the rest of his life.
After airing the story, were you hopeful that the two young men would change their life, or something would trigger?
Yeah, I was hopeful that they would get out of it, you know. I remember talking to both their mothers at the time, and yeah, I was hopeful, but it didn't go that way. It just got worse. I mean, they both ended up one ended up dead, shot and killed, and the other one ended up in prison for the rest of his life. So, I mean, but I'll tell you, I had a teacher, a 5th grade teacher from South Central somewhere, who wrote me a long letter and said that he had shown that piece to 5,000 students. And he said it had more impact than anything he'd ever shown his students before, you know. So that made me feel good, you know.
Were there any tense moments when hanging out with the guys in the gang?
Well, I think, you know, when you're hanging around with a bunch of gangsters, and I think they'll say this about themselves, you never know what's going to happen, you know. I remember being out with a gang called Clantone on the San Fernando Valley one night, and we were out there a couple hours, and there's like a couple dozen of them on a street corner where they're hanging out there, and then they started disappearing after a while, you know. And I remember there were 2 guys, they were homeboys, buddies, you know. And I looked around, and all of a sudden they're rolling around the ground, and they're trying to kill each other, you know. And one had said something to the other, and these guys were like best buddies that he took as an insult, you know. And I just turned to my photographer and I said, "Get in the truck and get out of here." I mean, I thought somebody was going to end up dead. I mean, they were just pounding on each other, you know. It's just like, and so when you're around a gang, things can happen that at any given moment, just based on somebody saying the wrong thing or looking at you the wrong way. So there's always danger. There's always danger there, you know. And I just, I just tried to be cautious. And I never tried to talk like a gang member or anything. I always just talked like I talk. And I always tried to talk to gang members just like they're another human being. And I think, you know, somebody asked me once, would you, like, you know, even Father Greg Boyle, he talks to them a lot with gang talk, kind of. I never did that, you know. And I think some of them sort of appreciated the fact that I was there and I was just me, you know.
In your opinion, was it more dangerous in the 90s, or is it more dangerous today in this era?
Well, I think it was more dangerous in the 90s than it is today, but then I'm not out on the streets today either. And certainly the gang thing is going full-blown, not only in Los Angeles, but all across the country. You know, organized crime, if you've ever seen Martin Scorsese's movie, Gangs of New York, I mean, in the 1860s, they had the same gang problem we're talking about today, you know. So, I mean, it's just, I think, you know, each immigrant group that comes to the country, I mean, it's happened with the Italians, the Irish, the Polish, you're on the bottom of the food chain, you get pushed into crime, you're a have-not. And so it's always there, And I think it goes back to the little Dutch boy with his finger in the dike. That's about all you can do. But I don't think we do enough. And I think that the one thing that we don't do is really talk about it. And I think everybody has a hand in this game. Whether it's the police, or it's the parents of kids in that neighborhood, or it's the media and how they present this stuff. I mean, everybody has a role to play, and nobody really does it together, I think, long enough. It just, does that make any sense? It's just like, it's a continual problem that never goes away. And every time we have a new mayor, they'll talk about, getting the gang problem, and they'll appoint a gang czar. And I'll tell you, these guys like in the U.S. Attorney's Office, and the FBI, and even in LAPD and the sheriffs that work gangs over the years, but some of them are really good guys that have kids. A lot of them grew up in these neighborhoods. They do want to make a difference, And some of them get jaded over time because, it's the same old thing all the time. But you can't stop talking about it, and you can't stop looking for solutions. And it's never going to go away, but it can be better. It can always be better. I think I think we need to do more in the schools about gangs. If you're starting in kindergarten, you start hearing, this isn't a way to live. You could even put it in readers and stuff. You don't shoot people. I was speaking to a class of 5th graders once in Glasell Park, and the teacher said, would you talk to the class, And I remember saying, and there's probably 25 kids in this class, and I said, how many of you have a family member or somebody you know who's been shot in a gang thing? And 80% of those kids raised their hands, And that's not even a really, really thick gang area, It's just, but isn't that sad? I mean, when I was 5th grade, I wasn't worrying about something like that, And I'm not so sure that 50 years ago, that even in that neighborhood, they were worried as much as they are today. Part of it is it's easy to get. Somebody told me once that the difference today compared to, say, the 50s, they didn't have a lot of money in the 50s, but now with the drug dealing and everything, they've got money for cars, which they can drive to different neighborhoods. They have money to buy guns. They have the trappings of being a gangster, driving a nice car, having a pretty girlfriend, having influence in the neighborhood, So that's different today, and really the movies can make this look like a glamorous thing a lot of the time, I mean, even when you go to The Sopranos, it's living in a big mansion, and but the bottom line is, when you look through everything, it's a loser's way of life. It's a loser's way of life, because if you're really a hardcore gangster, you're going to prison for the rest of your life, or you're going to be dead. And you know who's going to kill you? Your best friend. That's who they send, because he can get close to you, And can you imagine that, having to kill your best friend? I remember we did this story way out. It was like in Hemet or something, and it was a courtroom. And this guy, he was probably 20 or something, but he had been ordered to kill his best friend, and he did it. And he was getting life without the possibility of parole. And I remember him just sitting there at that table, sobbing and sobbing and sobbing, just like a little baby, But I mean, can you imagine what was going through his head? First of all, he killed somebody, and it was his best friend, and now he's going to spend the rest of his life in prison. Not to mention the damage it did to his family, knowing that he killed his best friend, and his best friend's family. You kill someone, you don't just kill that person. You kill a whole bunch of other people's lives too. Because when your son or daughter is murdered, or your brother, you carry that for the rest of your life. And if your brother's a murderer, your family carries that for the rest of their life too. So it's nothing to laugh at or glamorize. It's terrible, terrible stuff.
Thank you, Mr. Blatchford. Incredible stuff. Gold. Thank you. Now, moving ahead. At some point, we stopped seeing Chris Blatchford on Fox 11 and his Fox Undercover specials. What happens? Why did the story stop?
I have to be very careful with this, because Fox became a different place. When I first went to work for Fox, it was the executives were old CBS guys, and they sort of, Rupert Murdoch had just bought Metro Media, 5 stations, and there was no agenda what to do. And these guys pretty much just said, do what you want, And I worked with this one producer I'd worked with at CBS, and we just started doing what we want. And I remember, I think one of the first pieces we did was about welfare fraud and guys getting food stamps and taking them in and selling them for 50 cents on the dollar at crooked grocery stores who would turn them in and get $1 back on them, and they paid 50 cents for them. And these guys were doing it just at that time, it was crack cocaine, And I remember after we did that story, and we had a lot of reaction to it, and they just sort of said, go do what you want, and we did, from about 1992 to about 2000, we did a lot of great stuff. But the management changed. New people came in, and Roger Ailes became a head of Fox, and they had this whole kind of right-wing agenda, and it didn't fit in with what we were doing, And I think the new managers didn't even know what we did,
Do they ask you to go in a different direction, or do you?
No, you just
do they just stop the stories altogether?
It's just like you don't have the same people to pitch it to, and nobody's listening when you do, and I don't. The new people had no idea really what we did or the impact of what we did at that time, and that's a bad thing about TV. There's a lot of turnover in management. And a new guy comes in and he has some formula that worked in Poughkeepsie, New York or something that's never going to work in LA. And I'll tell you, Don Hewitt was the head of 60 Minutes for many years. He said it, and Shakespeare said it too. Don Hewitt said, the story is the thing. The story, and Shakespeare said the same thing, the play is the thing, And that's true. I mean, people watch TV to see interesting stories. They don't really watch to see pretty girls. They can see that anywhere they want. They don't watch to laugh like a sitcom or something. But they want to see an interesting story.
How long after management changes do you stay on with Fox?
I stayed a long time after that. Another 8 years or so.
And what kind of stories are you doing then?
Well, I'm doing a lot more general assignment. I'm still able to do. Let's say during sweeps is like 4 weeks, and I would do at the height maybe out of those 4 weeks, of those 28 days, I'd probably had stories on 14 to 20 days, and then later, go up 7 or 8 years later, and I'd have maybe 1 night or 2 nights, And they're just interested, the bosses are interested in something else.
When this is going on, how are you feeling personally?
Well, at that point, I'm no spring chicken anymore, I tried to get out at one time, but nobody at other stations in town picked me up because they're not doing that kind of thing either. They're doing their minute and a half every day, and news is downsizing in the 2000s. They're not trying to spend as much money as they used to. They're doing like shows like, when I first came to town, you had maybe you had a morning cut-ins on the Today Show, you had maybe a noon newscast, and then maybe a 5 o'clock and a 6 o'clock and an 11 o'clock. Well, now you look, news starts at 5 in the morning and it goes till 10. It picks up again maybe at 1 or 2 and goes to 6, and then it goes, and I remember talking to one of the reporters at Channel 7 one day, and he was saying, it's gotten so I come in the morning, I have an hour to work on the story, and the rest of the day I'm just re-racking that story and doing live shots all day. And 20 years ago he would have taken all day to work on that one story for one newscast or maybe 2 newscasts, And that's what changed. It was a money thing, it's cheaper. You know, it's cheaper to do the news than buy like a Cosby series or something and put it on the air. And all these people, I think, figured that out, you know. And they just, yeah, a lot of it had to do just with resources. You could use the same resources and do 10 hours of programming instead of 3, you know. And those are shows you wouldn't have to buy, sitcoms or dramas you wouldn't have to pay for, you know.
Eventually, you do leave Fox officially. Do you leave, or you let go? Or what happens for you? What's the linchpin for you to finally say goodbye?
At the time, management had changed like the 3rd time. I'm now 68 years old, and I'm not getting to do the things that I want. I mean, I still love doing a lot of the general assignment things, you know, but I was not getting to do like the investigative things that we did before. And I was going on vacation, and I turned to my photographer one day and just said, you know what, I'm not coming back. And I didn't. And then I filed a lawsuit against them too. And they call it like, there's a name for it, where you don't get fired, but they make it difficult enough that you leave, you know. And I sued them, and I got a little money, but not much, you know. But,
understandable, man.
Yeah.
You were a legend in that newsroom.
Well, you know, by the time I left, there'd been 3 managers in a period of maybe less than a decade. They had no idea what I did or any appreciation for what we did, or the other guys there who worked with me, the photographers and the producers, and they just didn't care. They had their own little stupid formula, you know, and it wasn't a good fit anymore, you know.
Fox's loss. Eventually, though, you rise back up again with a new book. You begin writing books, starting off with a famous book called The Black Hand.
Yes.
You write it with a former Mexican mafia member, Rene "Boxer" Enriquez. First of all, I want to know, why do you decide to write a book on such a dangerous subject?
Well, I started doing my first story about the Mexican mafia, I think, in 1988. And there was a group of mafia guys who'd been locked down for a long time, since the late 70s, that were now coming back out on the streets with a bunch of new mafia members. And one of them was Rene, so-called Boxer Enriquez. And I did a number of stories mentioning him because he became a major player in the organization. And at one point, his mother called me and chewed my ass out. Could I make her son look like this bad person, this murderer, which he was. But she said he really wants kids not to be in gangs. And if you would write him a letter, you know, he's all about, you know, that, reaching out to kids and everything. So I called this friend of mine in the sheriff's department, you know, who got me into a lot of these stories. And I said, you know, this Mexican mafia guy's mom called me, you know, and she was really angry. But I might add, by the end of the conversation, I talked to her for about 20 minutes. She said, it's nice to know. I told her, you know, I don't know her son, but I get all this through court cases and police intelligence, and I'm just doing my job. And I remember she said at the end, well, it's nice to know, Mr. Blatchford, that you're a nice man, you know. But anyway, but I knew, you know, last thing I needed in life was some mobster's mom mad at me, you know. So I called this friend of mine in the sheriff's department. He said, no, write him a letter, you know. He said, you never know what'll come. So I wrote him like a letter, and he was aware of what I'd done over the years. And he wrote me a long letter back with little happy faces written on it, and it's just saying, you know, I hold you no ill will. I know you're just doing your job. And he said, keep the lines of communication open. So for the next decade or so, I'd always send him a Christmas card, and he'd send me a Christmas card and with a little note. And once he had, you know, in Pelican Bay, you can't have pictures taken of yourself. And he had no pictures of himself, but I had pictures of him in court. And he was wondering if I could get some pictures from the court to give his family. And I did that and sent him some photos once, you know, and a couple other things. And then one day the phone rang, and a friend of mine who works in CDC said, you know, Boxer Enriquez dropped out of the mafia, you know. And I said, really, you know, and I'd be the last guy I ever guessed would have done that, you know. And then a few days later, I got a call from Boxer, and we talked for about an hour. And it was like we were old buddies. we had a lot of laughs and everything, and he's a very engaging guy. And he said that, he'd like to write a book and he'd like me to do it, Or actually his father called first and said that he was going to call me. And he said, Renee said he wanted to do a book and he'd like you to do it. Could he call you? And then he called me a few days later. And we talked for about an hour, And we'd never met. And he's a smart guy, an engaging guy, and sorry he ever got into this whole thing now, He could have done a lot of things, He was a pretty smart, good-looking guy, real hustler, He could have made life a better life. His dad had a good business as a master carpenter, He built like all the bars and bar stools that built more hotel. He had a really high-end carpentry business.
Does Boxer ever reveal to you why he chose to take that route in life?
Yeah. If you read the book, it lays out everything, But if you want me to answer that in a brief way, I can probably, His brother was in it, in the gang. They lived in Cerritos, which was not a heavy, but Arleta was right near there, and there was a gang there. His brother started hanging out with that gang, and his brother sort of grabbed him in. They weren't heavily supervised as kids. His dad was an alcoholic. His mom even got into drugs later on. They didn't have a lot of supervision, I think. They sort of let their kids do what they wanted, And he was one of the few Latino guys in high school. He wasn't a great student at the time. He loved to party. He got in with a bunch of surfer kids at one time, He was selling marijuana at the age of 14 and always had change in his pocket. That looked like a pretty easy life to him, I think, And it just escalated from there. And then when he went to prison, he met a mafia guy. And then he started doing little things for them, and then bigger and bigger things. And God, he was like early 20s, and he was a full-fledged mafia member.
Was there anything you kept out of the book that might have been dangerous for either of you?
There's one thing we kept out of the book that I'll tell you about later, but I'm not going to say it on the air for the reasons. Yeah.
Were you happy with the final version of the book?
Oh, yeah, very happy. Yeah. I had a really... HarperCollins did it, and the guy who was the editor there was really a good guy. He embraced the project. They didn't interfere with it at all. They loved whatever we gave them. They made one criticism when I handed in the first manuscript. I'd been covering the mafia for over 20 years, more than 20 years, and half the stories I had in the book didn't mention Renee. And this editor said, well, is this book about Renee or is it about the mafia? And I went, well, that's really a good point, It's about both. So I went back and all the stories that I didn't include Renee in, he knew about and had some involvement with it, at least on the periphery of it. And so I laced him into every story, and it became a great narrative for the whole book. It was a great criticism from the editor, and it really, in the end, made the book. Yeah.
The Black Hand, such a great title.
Yeah.
Who chooses it?
I did. Yeah.
How do you choose it? Why that?
Well, one reason, Renee had a big tattoo right here on his chest of the Black Hand, and they called themselves the Black Hand, the Mafia, and I just thought, like, with that, we had his picture on the cover, and but long before that, I just thought, it's got to be called the Black Hand,
Does your family ever try to talk you out of writing this book, or even covering the subject?
No, not really.
What was everyone's reaction to your book once it's released?
Well, I had tremendous reaction to the book. I've been all over the Southwest speaking at gang conferences about it. I think it's highly read. I had a parole officer tell me every parole search they do in LA County, they find a copy of the book. Every cop I know that works gangs has a copy of the book. Guys back on the East Coast have it. I go back to gang. I was in Las Vegas doing it. Everybody there had the book. It's really done well, and I think because it's a good story. It's not just about the mafia. It's about this guy's life and how it really. How the mafia really ruined his life and ruins people's lives. Their main business really is ruining people's lives.
You wrote this book many years ago. In your opinion, is the Mexican mafia's reach stronger than ever?
You know, I mean, I've been out of it for 8 years. You know, I haven't been as involved in it. I think there are maybe more solid connections today between drug cartels in Mexico and our Mexican mafia here. I think there's a symbiotic relationship that has grown in that regard. The cartels know that they have like a McDonald's franchise here with every gang to sell for them. You know, they don't want to have to be coming into these neighborhoods and selling the drugs themselves. So both groups benefit from it financially, and they do hits for each other. The Mexican mafia here does hits across the border and comes back here, and cartel guys come over on our side and do murders and go back. You know, so it's worked out for both groups. Whether it's more powerful today or not, I don't know. It's a good question. But I go back to what I've said in this earlier interview. You know, the gang thing and organized crime never goes away. And I think it rears its ugly head more when, say, a real strong-headed, charismatic guy comes out of prison and he comes back to a certain neighborhood and the whole thing gets beefed up again, you know, and it's cyclical. And then maybe he's locked down and all the people, the associates around him, a bunch of them get locked down, the feds even do a case, and it calms down in that area a little bit. But then, you know, his younger brother, you know, 5 years younger, he comes out of prison and he starts it up again. And it's a cycle that goes on and on and on again, you know. But I'll tell you one thing, you know, when I was first doing stories about the mafia in the late 80s, the FBI wasn't involved at all. And now the feds have gotten heavily involved. They've done a handful of RICO cases, and they recognize now the threat of the Mexican mafia, which they didn't in, say, 1980 or 1985. And the feds have become a major force now in prosecuting the Mexican mafia and other organized crime in Los Angeles.
As you mentioned, Boxer drops his association with the Mexican mafia and he debriefs. I believe because of him debriefing, they also lessened his sentence or promised him early release or something like that. But when the day came, they reneged on his release due to public outcry. Am I correct with that information? And do you remember that happening?
Yeah, he was paroled, and he was going to get out, and he was sitting in his jail cell, and he was supposed to know by, I think it was 7 o'clock at night, or 5 o'clock at night, and he got 7 o'clock, and he'd never heard anything. But they revoked his parole when he was all set to get out. And he finally got out a couple of years later. But you know what happened is there was I think they call it the President's Club or something. There's a bunch of rich people from Los Angeles that are President's Company, have like a President's Club, and they have lectures that come every month or whatever. And one of these guys was like riding around with police, I think, in Hawthorne, I think it was. And they were telling him about Rene, you know. And he was like an auxiliary police officer on the weekends or something, but he's like a Malibu billionaire, you know. And he was fascinated with it, and he wondered if Rene could speak to this group, you know, because he was entrepreneurial among the Mexican mafia, they thought, you know. And it'd be interesting for all these entrepreneurs to hear that. So he did this, and with the cooperation, he didn't want to do it because he knew he was going to come up for parole again, but a guy from LAPD sort of prevailed on him to do it. And then the LA Times, they brought him in like a caravan of cars to this club downtown to speak at this place. And a friend of mine in the LA Times said they saw these cars going by and they followed him to this speech. And then they wrote about it. They weren't allowed to come inside. And then the powers that be got their nose out of shape because this convicted killer mafia guy was out of prison talking to these businessmen, and that caused him to have his parole yanked, you know, later on, you know, because people were complaining. People with power were complaining, you know. And but again, you know, he put his head to the grindstone and tried to change his life, and he has changed, and he's out now, you know. And I told him in the beginning, when we started to write this book, there was no idea in his mind that he'd ever get out of prison, and nor mine either. But the book resonated with so many people. He became famous, and all the feds and the sheriff, everybody started using him to testify in cases, and it grew and it grew and it grew. And I remember then he started thinking, like, a few years down the line, maybe I can get out, And I told him, I said, don't ever think that. I said, because the guys you're dealing with in the feds may be straight up guys that are, hoping to do that for you, but there'll be some guy in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington who wants to be governor of Maryland someday and doesn't want that to happen on his watch, and he'll kill the whole deal. And kind of that's what happened, So I always warned him of that. And so when he did get out, I just said, all you can do is just try to change your life. Keep working at it. He's been sober for a long time now, clean and sober. He's quite well read. He's done a good job of educating himself, and he's a changed guy, I think.
Another book you write is called Three Dog Nightmare, a painful look at the realities of drug addiction. Why do you decide to write this book?
Well, I knew somebody who was in drug rehab, and I was going to the meetings, like the family meetings on the weekends, and I went to about a half dozen of them. And there was this guy whose son was there, and his son was a heroin addict. And I said to my friend, now, who is that guy, And he looked familiar. Well, it was Chuck Negron, who was one of the lead singers in the group Three Dog Night. And he'd been a heroin addict for like more than 20 years. And that group was the biggest group in the world for about 4 years, They had the platinum record. They were the first group to ever sell more than 500,000 records. And they were the first group to do like stadium concerts. I mean, they were that popular. They were really good. And I said to this guy after a while, I said, all the stories you've shared here, you should write a book, And he said, well, if you're, and I've been clean and sober for, several years, and you're not supposed to really make money off AA and NA, stuff like that. But a few months went by, and he called me one night, and he said, that book you mentioned, he said, I might be interested, could you drop by the house and talk about that? And I had told him, I have friends that have been writing books their whole life, and I thought I'd recommend one, And so I went over to his house one night, and we talked for a couple hours, and he said, all right, let's do this. And I said, what, you want me to do it, And he said, well, yeah, you're easy to talk to, and, you know a lot about this stuff already, that I've talked about at these groups. And he said, yeah, I'd like you to do it, And I said, well, I'll tell you, I've been writing my whole life, but I've never written a book before. But yeah, okay, let's do it, So we went ahead and did it,
Were you happy with the outcome of your book?
Yeah, I have one regret. I wrote it in the first person, and so people think that he wrote it, and he didn't write any of it. I should have written it in third person. I wrote it in first person, and I should have written it in third person because, a lot of people thought he wrote the book, and I lost credit for that a lot, But it was interesting. It opened up that whole rock and roll world. I talked to a lot of people that were huge in that business, and that's an interesting business,
Do you have any more books coming up? Are you thinking about anything in the future?
Yes. There's one I've been flirting with ever since I retired, but things have happened that have sort of put it on the back burner. But yeah, there's at least one more in me, I think.
Thank you. We look forward to it. Now, Mr. Blatchford, this has been a great interview. Thank you so much for joining us again, man. It's been an incredible interview.
You're welcome.
Now, I want to talk about things happening in the world today. First of all, investigative journalism. How much has it changed since your time at Fox 11? Has it changed for the better or for the worse?
I don't watch a lot of TV anymore. I think it's worse. But then, when I started in the business, old guys used to say, when we were young, it was a lot better than it is now. Yeah, so maybe me being older, I look on it today, and I don't think it's as good as what we did. And maybe that's not fair. Maybe that's just an old guy, talking about things he doesn't know about. But I don't think, if you look at all the stations now, I mean, journalism today is on its deathbed. You know, and people are confused about what journalism is. You know, with all these 24/7 news things, it's become commentary. And people think that, you know, these talk shows all day long are the news, but they're not really the news. The best of them can be good news analysis, but a lot of these people were never even news reporters. They were like political pundits, or they come from different walks of life, or they're talk show hosts, you know, and they're not really news people, you know, and I think you get a different take from a news person, you know, and many of these people on the air today on these 24/7 networks were never news people, and they don't approach it in that manner, and it's all about opinion, and they're feeding people what they want to hear in a lot of cases, especially the right-wing stations, you know, and it's sad. And the local level, they're just not putting the money into it like that. You know, if you're doing investigative journalism, real investigative journalism, it requires a lot of time and effort. And, you know, they're paying a reporter so much, they just want them on the air every day, you know, and they just want to fill those 8 hours of news they have every day.
Where do you get your news from? Who do you trust?
I really shouldn't say that, I don't think, you know.
Okay, I understand.
But you know, I have a TV station I watch. But
in your opinion, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And I have magazines and newspapers I watch.
There is a TV station that you do watch. You're not getting your news off of YouTube or the internet.
Most of my news is from the New York Times and the LA Times.
Thank you. Is there a television anchor that you trust more than anyone else? Do you have a favorite news anchor that you just can't miss?
On the national level?
Yes.
I don't think any of the news anchors on the national level today are up to the standards of the ones I grew up listening. Now, maybe it's just because I'm an older guy looking back, but I mean, people like Walter Cronkite and Dan Rather and John Chancellor, I mean, they were real newsmen, you know, and they earned their stripes. They worked their way up from the bottom. They've worked all over the country or all over the world. And I think a lot of these people today just don't have the chops that those guys have, you know. I think of the three major anchors, David Muir, I like. He's a good reader, and he has experience as a news guy, but not like these guys did in the generations before me, I think, you know. That era of my parents' generation, you know, those guys started all as war correspondents, and they were real grizzled newsmen, you know, both on TV and newspapers, and I think that's changed. I think that there's too much attention today to just pretty people and getting things done quickly and making a lot of money. You know, Don Hewitt, who was the head of started 60 Minutes and was ahead of his years. The first year 60 Minutes made money, which was about 10 years in. He said, this is the beginning of the end. Now that they know it can make money, we'll never be able to do what we did before. Yeah. Because they're just chasing profits, not the news.
Besides you, who do you consider the best investigative reporter in Los Angeles?
I wouldn't say. It would be unfair.
If you were still at CBS or Fox 11 right now, what subject would you like to cover?
Well, I love organized crime, you know, and I'll tell you, I've always been interested. I mean, I've talked to, not many people have talked to a lot of murderers in their life. I have, you know, and I'd say at least in half of those conversations, I leave and I go, you know, God, he didn't seem like a bad guy, you know. I mean, certain circumstances sort of drew him there. And so I've always been, what is that, where does that line where good ends and evil begins? You know, or are you born evil or do you become evil? And that, I've always been interested in that. And that has always driven me into the area of crime and organized crime, you know. Why did people make these decisions? Why, are they different than you and me? Are they born that way? It's bad choices. It just that line between good and evil is a fine line, and it's always interested me.
Chris, how would you like to be remembered in Los Angeles history?
Oh gosh, you know,
someone looking at this 10, 20, 40 years from now.
I'll tell you, I know exactly how, and I would like on my tombstone. When I was working in Miami, somebody wrote on my mailbox, a newsman's newsman. And that's what I'd like to be remembered as in LA as well.
Beautiful one. Thank you, man. If you could give any up-and-coming investigative reporters advice, what would it be?
Oh, God, it's tough today because, you know, journalism is dying. There aren't as many jobs. I would say just, you know, if you have a hankering to do investigative news, you're going to have to do a lot of it maybe on your own time at first to establish your chops. You may have to be working, you know, day of air assignments and everything. I did a lot of my stuff in the beginning in the evenings and on weekends. And if, you know, there are a few guys who get to be a full-time investigative reporter in local TV. And there are fewer and fewer that get that opportunity. I would just say, you know, like, if there's something, first of all, you've got to be a curious person, you know. And if there's anything around you that you're curious about, just start looking under the rug, man, you know. And they always say follow the money. That's always good advice as well, you know.
Follow the money. Thank you. Now, Mr. Blatchford, I always ask our guests to give us their top 5 list of graffiti vandals. However, we're changing it up for you. Can you please give us your top 5 all-time list of news anchors?
Oh boy, that's a pretty easy one. I think I like Huntley and Brinkley. I like Walter Cronkite. I like John Chancellor. And I like Dan Rather.
Wow. Thank you so much for that great list. Mr. Blatchford, it's been an honor to have you in studio. Thank you again for visiting us and sharing your incredible history of Los Angeles. We wish you the best going forward and hope to have you back in the future to discuss more newsworthy topics in Los Angeles.
Well, thank you for having me. I hope I didn't disappoint.
You did great. Okay. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for joining us for another episode of GRAFF TV. This has been the iconic investigative reporter, Chris Blatchford of Fox 11 News.